Chapter 1: A Storm Before the Storm. In the final decades of the 18th century, France stood like a jewel before the world. The Palace of Versailles shimmered in candlelight and polished gold. Its gardens were perfectly trimmed. Its fountains whispered elegance. Carriages rolled through courtyards lined with marble statues, and inside, courtiers in embroidered silks floated through balls beneath ceilings painted with angels and gods. To foreign eyes, France was eternal, divine, untouchable, and wrapped in perfection. But beyond the palace gates, the country whispered a different story. While the court dined on roasts and rare fruits, the people of the countryside shared soup made of roots and scraps. While queens wore gowns that cost more than a villager's yearly wage, farmhands toiled in dirt for bread that barely fed a family. The glitter was real, but only for a few. For the rest, France was a field of aching backs and thin children. There were no riots yet, no torches, no cries for justice. Just the quiet noise of absence, the empty shelves, the missing meat, the silence where laughter once lived. The divide was not only between rich and poor, it was between seen and unseen. The nobility paraded through salons and stage shows, never glancing toward the frozen fields outside Paris, where mothers buried their infants in shallow graves, and prayed for rain that never came. The illusion of glory persisted, carefully painted, orchestrated, and presented like a stage play. But behind the curtain, the weight of the kingdom sagged. The king's court spun in a fantasy, while the base of the pyramid strained. France, so dazzling in the eyes of the world, was hollow at its heart, and the silence in its villages was not peace, it was pressure. Cracks in the crown. Louis XVI came to the throne not as a warrior or a visionary, but as a hesitant young man burdened by an old and crumbling system. His crown glistened, but the power it symbolized was already splintering. France was drowning in debt. The glory of previous kings, their wars, their palaces, their indulgences had left behind a mountain of costs. And every coin that paid. For pride came from the hands of those who could least afford to give. The 7 Years' War had drained the royal treasury. Then, in a bid to weaken their old enemy Britain, France lent its support to the American colonies in their revolution. It was a symbolic victory, a nod to freedom, oddly enough. But the cost was staggering. Millions of livres spent on ships, soldiers, and supplies, all while farms failed and grain grew scarce back home. France's tax system was not built to recover from such wounds. It did not ask the rich to help. In fact, the First Estate, the clergy, and the Second Estate, the nobility, were largely spared from taxation. It was the Third Estate, the peasants, merchants, laborers, and townspeople who carried the burden. As the nation struggled, the weight did not fall evenly. It fell where it always had, on the bent backs of the poor. Louis XVI tried to fix it. He brought in reformers. He called for changes. But every attempt to adjust the system was blocked by those who benefited most from its imbalance. The nobles refused. The clergy objected. The crown itself, once unquestioned, now appeared weak, not from rebellion, but from indecision. Like a ship with sails but no wind, France drifted. And beneath it, the cracks grew deeper. Bread and burden in the winding streets of Paris and the muddy paths of the countryside. The revolution began, not with gunpowder, but with flour. Bread was not just food in France. It was life. It was morning, noon, and evening. It was what filled the silence of a home. When bread was plenty, there was calm. But when it grew scarce or dear, hearts panicked. The 1780s brought poor harvests. The winters were bitter, the rains cruel. Grain prices soared. A loaf of bread, once affordable, now cost more than many could earn in a day. In cities, women waited in lines that stretched for blocks. They stood with baskets in hand, children clinging to their skirts, hoping for a crust that might not come. Fights broke out. Shops closed early. Some bakeries were stormed. But mostly, there was waiting, long tired waiting in the homes of the Third Estate. Dinner became thinner. Porridge instead of bread, water instead of wine. And when the food vanished entirely, so did sleep. Fathers walked through night forests, searching for anything that could feed a child. Mothers went without so their babies might eat. The pain was not just physical. It was moral, a slow-breaking humiliation that chipped away at pride, at patience, at hope that the bread crisis was not simply hunger. It was a symbol. It told the people they were forgotten, that their lives mattered less, that no one, not the king, not the nobles, not the clergy, saw their suffering. And in that daily act of waiting for bread, something else began to rise. A question, a whisper. Why should we starve while others feast? The weight of privilege. To understand the fury that would come, one must first understand the weight that pressed on the common soul. In France, society was divided into three official estates. The first was the clergy, those who prayed. The second was the nobility, those who ruled. And the third, those who worked, included nearly everyone else. 98% of France, the first and second estates held wealth and privilege. They paid few taxes. They owned land. They lived in mansions and chateaux, enjoyed royal pensions, and held influence in court. Many had never tilled soil or stitched cloth or tended fire, but they lived as if the world belonged to them. Their power was not just in law, but in custom. It was assumed they were better. The Third Estate bore the kingdom. They built the bridges, harvested the wheat, cleaned the streets, and filled the armies. Yet they had no voice in decisions. Number. Real protection under law. If a nobleman struck a servant, it was discipline. If a servant resisted, it was treason. A commoner could be hanged for stealing a loaf, while a noble who cheated hundreds faced nothing. This imbalance was not only financial, it was spiritual. It declared, from birth, who was worthy and who was not. It told a peasant girl, before she could read or dream, that she would serve, that her life was for others' comfort, that her hunger was her destiny. And though these words were not always spoken aloud, they were written into every tax, every rule, every bowed head. It was not just that the rich lived well. It was that they lived well on the suffering of others and expected thanks for it. Whispers of change, but even in the darkest rooms, a candle can be lit. In the salons of Paris, in dusty libraries, in the back rooms of taverns and the margins of letters, a new kind of voice began to rise. These were not shouts. Not yet. They were questions. Quiet, elegant, dangerous questions. Thinkers like Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Voltaire had begun to write ideas that shimmered with possibility. They spoke of natural rights, of freedom, equality, reason. They questioned the divine right of kings. They asked whether society should serve only the few, Their words were printed in small pamphlets, discussed in cafes, whispered by firelight. They traveled faster than armies and struck deeper than swords. To a starving farmer, a book meant little. But to his son, sent to a school, or to a merchant in a city, these ideas became seeds. They suggested that the way things were might not be the way they must remain, that perhaps a man's value was not in his birth, but in his breath, that perhaps the third estate was not broken, only bound. The change had not yet come, but it had been imagined, and once imagined, it could not be thought. In every whispered reading, in every debate behind closed doors, France edged closer to awakening. It had not yet screamed, but it had begun to stir. Chapter 2. The Three Estates. In the quiet candlelit sanctuaries of France, where golden candelabras flickered and vaulted ceilings echoed with chants, the First Estate moved with solemn dignity. They were the clergy, the keepers of souls and scriptures, the interpreters of God's will, and for centuries, the voices that stood between heaven and earth. The church did not merely preach, it ruled. Bishops and abbots held more land than many nobles, and the church as a whole owned nearly a tenth of all land in France. From the smallest village chapels to the towering cathedrals in Paris, religion was not just a belief, it was a structure, a hierarchy, and for the poor, often the only bridge to something greater. The clergy were divided too, though not by official decree. At the top stood cardinals and bishops, often born of noble blood, who moved through marble corridors and attended royal ceremonies. They were men of silken sermons, wearing vestments that cost more than a peasant earned in a year. They were educated, eloquent, and distant from the hunger that plagued the countryside. Below them were the parish priests, many of whom came from modest families. These lower clergy knew the pain of their parishioners. They walked the dirt paths, blessed the dying, and baptized the poor. But they, too, were caught in a system that placed holiness behind hierarchy. The church collected the tithe, a mandatory tax of 10% on income, grain, or goods. For the poor, this was not a donation, it was a duty. And though the church claimed to give back through charity, hospitals, and schools, much of the wealth accumulated at the top. Gilded sanctuaries in Paris contrasted with broken pews in the provinces. Faith remained, but reverence began to fade. When bread grew scarce and children cried of hunger, prayers alone could not fill a stomach. Slowly, the clergy's divine image began to dim. People wondered, had the church become more loyal to crowns than to Christ? In a world where God was used to justify order, the church had once been untouchable. But by the late 18th century, its silence in the face of suffering spoke louder than its sermons. While sermons called for obedience, hearts began to stir with a quiet question. If God loved all, why did his spokesman live in palaces while his people starved? The kingdom of nobles above the common people, but beneath the crown, the second estate, glimmered with inherited pride. They were the nobility lords of land, guardians of legacy, and recipients of privilege simply by birth. In a kingdom built on tradition, they represented continuity. Their titles were old, their names etched into history, and their roles often ceremonial. They held the right to hunt, to tax, to command militias, and most critically, to avoid the taxes others paid. They did not plow the land, yet it fed them. They did not work the mills, yet they profited from them. It was a world designed not by merit, but by memory. Many nobles lived far from the fields they owned. They spent their days in Versailles or in provincial chateaux lined with mirrors and embroidery. Their wealth was inherited, not earned. Their days were filled with fencing, letters, music, and affairs of reputation. Some took pride in service as military officers or governors, but for many, duty had faded into detachment. The people who worked their land became numbers in ledgers. Rent was collected through stewards. Disputes were settled by judges. The nobility's hands remained clean, not because there was no labor, but because it was always done by others. And yet, beneath the powdered wigs and lace sleeves, fear began to creep in. Respect was no longer automatic. Peasants once bowed. Now they muttered. Merchants once deferred. Now they competed. And some nobles, seeing the signs, tried to reform. They built schools or eased dues. But these were the few. Most clung to their entitlements, convinced that privilege was divine. Their world felt eternal. Yet it was built on shifting soil. For generations, titles had protected them. The law was their ally, and history their shield. But as books circulated, and ideas ignited salons and cafes, a new nobility began to rise not of blood, but of thought. Philosophers questioned inequality. Writers mocked aristocracy with satire and wit. The ink of Voltaire and Rousseau began to erode what time had preserved. It was not hatred that first stirred against the nobility, it was irrelevance. And in time, irrelevance would become indignation. The nation below at the base of France's Grand Pyramid stood the Third Estate. They were not a class, they were the nation itself. From bakers and blacksmiths to teachers, tailors, carpenters, farmers, and the homeless. They made up more than 95% of the population. They tilled the fields, built the roads, taught the children, and baked the bread. They paid nearly all the taxes and bore nearly all the weight. And yet, they had the least voice. In the countryside, peasants worked lands they did not own, often under harsh conditions. Harvests were uncertain, winters cruel, and the burden of dues relentless. They paid to the church, to the noble, and to the crown. Each year, the weight pressed heavier. A poor harvest meant starvation. A late frost could ruin everything. There were no safeties. And yet, they endured. In the towns, artisans crafted goods in narrow workshops. Merchants traded under growing restrictions. Urban workers navigated a different kind of poverty, less predictable, but equally hard. Bread riots erupted when prices spiked. Children grew thin. Hope dimmed. Education was rare. Rights were fewer still. And above them all, the glittering classes feasted. And yet, the Third Estate was not silent. Beneath the strain, there was thought. Beneath the poverty, there was pride. They read pamphlets passed in secret. They attended lectures when they could. They spoke in taverns, markets, and homes. Their complaints were not only about hunger. They spoke of dignity, of justice, of fairness. They began to ask, if we carry the kingdom, should we not help shape it? This awakening was slow, but steady. A rising sense that they were not merely subjects, they were citizens. That being born poor did not mean being born lesser. That their labor deserved more than crumbs. This was not yet revolution. It was the soft rustling of minds, turning toward the light. The Grievance books in the spring of 1789, King Louis XVI called for the Estates General to meet a rare gathering of representatives from all three estates. It was meant to find solutions, especially for the growing financial crisis. But before they gathered, the king asked the people to write. Each parish and district across France was invited to submit cahiers de doléances, notebooks of complaints and hopes. These were the grievance books they poured in by the thousands. From dusty villages and crowded cities, people wrote what they had never been asked before. What would you change? What is wrong? What do you hope for? The pages were not filled with anger, but with earnestness. They spoke of unfair taxes, corrupt officials, roads that needed mending, bread too costly to buy. They asked for fair representation, for the church to share its wealth, for nobles to carry some burden. They did not yet demand the end of monarchy, they asked for reform. They did not yet curse the crown, they asked it to listen. But as the books piled high, the silence remained. The king's court read few, answered fewer. The grievances became dust on marble floors. Hopes raised by the invitation to speak began to turn into frustration. They had believed they were being heard, but the silence, once again, was deafening. And so something changed. The notebooks were not burned. They were kept. They became fuel. What began as dialogue became defiance. The people saw their words ignored, their hopes shelved. And they realized something simple but powerful. When those above refused to hear, those below began to shout that these books, quiet, honest, and full of heart, were the beginning of a deeper cry. They were not written by radicals, but by neighbors, by workers and mothers, by villagers and priests. And in every line, the soul of a nation whispered, "We are here. We matter." And soon they would not whisper. They would rise. Chapter 3. The King and the Crisis. In the stillness of Versailles, past golden halls and velvet-draped balconies, sat a man not built for the age he ruled. Louis XVI was not cruel. He was not eager for war or thirsty for power. He was, above all, a quiet man, a figure weighed down not by his ego, but by the unbearable expectations of a crown forged in blood. He had inherited one of the grandest thrones in the world, and with it, a nation trembling under the weight of its own history. Louis loved simple things. He tinkered with locks in his workshop, finding comfort in the turning of keys and the ticking of mechanisms. It gave him control, something he seldom felt elsewhere. He was more at ease among tools and gears than in court debates or grand audiences. His speech, when delivered to crowds or ministers, was often hesitant. His manner was mild, his words uncertain. In a world demanding vision, he offered silence. And in a storm that required movement, he often stood still. He was deeply devoted to his wife Marie Antoinette, though even that relationship was slow to bloom. Both young and unprepared, they arrived on the world stage more like actors learning their lines than rulers shaping destiny. Louis believed in order. He trusted tradition. He thought that by keeping the past intact, the future might remain calm. But France was not calm. The world was shifting, and his instincts to wait, to delay, to reflect, left him behind. At times he tried. He listened to advisors, approved reforms, opened discussions. But each step forward met resistance from nobles, clergy, or even his own fear. He was not a king who ruled with an iron will. He was a king who hoped in vain that peace could be preserved through passivity. And though his heart may have been kind, his inaction would cost him dearly. History does not spare those who mean well, but move too slowly. A treasury in collapse, the grandeur of Versailles masked a hollow center. Beneath the silk and marble, France was drowning in debt. Years of war, especially the costly 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, had emptied the royal coffers. The nobility and clergy paid little or nothing in taxes. The burden fell on the Third Estate, who had little left to give. And yet, the court continued to spend. Balls glittered. Dresses shimmered. Fireworks lit the sky. But the treasury dimmed into. This crisis came reformers men like Anne-Robert Jacques Turgot, a brilliant economist with bold ideas. He proposed that the privileged estates pay taxes, that trade be freed, that waste be cut. His ideas were sound, his courage firm, but the nobles hated him. They resisted change, fearing the loss of power and privilege. And so Turgot was dismissed. Next came Jacques Necker, a Swiss banker with a talent for public image. He published the royal accounts, letting the people see the numbers for the first time. It was meant to build trust, but it only sparked outrage. The expenses were massive, the income too small. Necker tried to borrow. He tried to patch holes in a sinking ship, but borrowing only postponed the inevitable. When the king removed him, the people rioted in support. Then came Charles Alexander de Calonne. He saw the truth. Clearly, only a full reform of taxation could save France. He called for a universal land tax, no exemptions. He sought support from the Assembly of Notables, hoping they would see reason, but they refused. They would not vote to tax themselves. And so, Calonne too was dismissed. Each advisor pointed to the same truth. Each plan reached the same wall. Reform could not happen without sacrifice from the top, and the top would not bend. The king, caught between fear of revolt and fear of rebellion from the elites, chose inaction. So the debt grew. The anger deepened. The clock ticked out the cost of bread and glory in Paris. The bakeries no longer smelled sweet. Bread the most. Basic food, the lifeline of the poor, became harder to find and harder still to afford. A series of harsh winters and poor harvests had devastated the grain supply. Prices soared. Wages did not. Mothers waited in long lines for a loaf that might be gone before they reached the front. Children cried with hunger. And across the city, whispers turned into murmurs of despair. France had poured millions into supporting the American colonies in their fight for freedom. It was a victory of ideas, but a costly one. Ships were sunk, soldiers lost, gold drained. The revolution overseas gave France pride, but no profit. Now, with fields bare and treasuries empty, the cost of glory became too heavy to bear. In the countryside, farmers struggled to keep livestock alive. In cities, men searched for work that vanished day by day. Rumors spread like wildfire of hoarding, of plots, of grain stolen by the wealthy. Riots flared in marketplaces. Storehouses were looted. Police were overwhelmed. The streets no longer trusted the palace, and the palace could no longer see the streets. Marie Antoinette, though often unfairly blamed, became a symbol of excess. Her dresses, her jewels, her supposed indifference all fed the anger. Let them eat cake, a phrase she never said, became a weapon of satire. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered was perception. And the people perceived coldness, distance, and a ruling class blind to their pain. Even those loyal to the crown began to feel uneasy. Something was shifting. It was not yet rebellion, but it was no longer peace. Beneath every empty plate, every stolen loaf, and every shuttered shop was a question with no answer. How long can this go on? Calling the Estates General by the end of 1788, the crisis could no longer be delayed. The treasury was near collapse, the people restless, the nobles uncooperative. In desperation, Louis XVI made a decision not taken for nearly 2 centuries. He summoned the Estates General, a meeting of representatives from all 3 estates, to gather and find a solution. It was a bold step, and it would be his undoing. The Estates General had last met in 1614. It was an old institution, one rooted in medieval structure. Each estate would have its own group of delegates. Each group would vote. But there was a catch. The first and second estates, though smaller in number, could outvote the third. It was a system designed to protect the few at the cost of the many. Still, the call to assemble gave the people hope. Across France, towns and parishes elected their delegates. Men of every walk, lawyers, merchants, priests, farmers, gathered their thoughts and wrote their grievances. They believed they would be heard. They believed change might come. For the first time in years, there was light at the edge of the storm. In May 1789, the Estates General opened at Versailles. It was a grand sight, robes and wigs, drums and banners. But beneath the ceremony, tensions ran deep. The Third Estate wanted real reform. They wanted votes counted by head, not estate. They wanted fairness, equality, a voice. But the First and Second Estates resisted. They feared losing control. As debate turned to gridlock, the Third Estate broke away. They formed the National Assembly. They declared themselves the true representatives of the nation. It was not rebellion yet, but it was a line drawn in history. The king had called them together, but once they had spoken, they would not be silenced. Louis hesitated. Again, he ordered them to disperse, then relented. He tried to bring them back under old rules, then wavered. His indecision became its own decision. Each delay, each pause, each missed moment allowed the momentum of the people to grow. The doors of change had opened not by force, but by invitation. And once opened, they could not be closed. Chapter 4. Voices in the Hall. The Palace of Versailles stood still under spring skies, yet inside, the walls began to stir. In May of 1789, the Estates General assembled for the first time in 175 years. France, wounded by debt and hunger, turned its eyes to this old institution, hoping it might offer healing. 3 estates walked into the same halls, but they did not walk together. Each carried its own history, its own fears, its own fire. The first estate, the clergy entered draped in flowing robes and cross-laced dignity. Some sought modest reforms. Others clung to power. They had known privilege for centuries and did not plan to part with it easily. The second estate, the nobility, stood tall in embroidered coats, powdered wigs, and memories of battles long past. They feared revolution more than ruin. To them, change was a threat. And then there was the third estate that came from cities, from villages, from the fields and shops and crowded alleys. They were merchants and lawyers, teachers and farmers. Their suits were plain, their language careful, their purpose burning. They did not arrive with the intent to upend the world. They came to survive it. They had been taxed beyond reason, ignored beyond patience. Now at last, they had been asked to speak. And they intended to be heard. The three estates met, but never merged. From the start, the question of voting poisoned the room. Under tradition, each estate voted as a block, meaning the first and second could always overrule the third. But the third estate demanded that votes be counted by head, not by class. They had more delegates, more people, more voice. Yet they were being asked to play a losing game. Debate turned to silence. Silence turned to standoff. The nobles delayed. The clergy wavered. And the third estate, tired of waiting, began to wonder whether the old rules had ever served them at all. Versailles, once a symbol of absolute power, now echoed with indecision. 3 rooms, 1 building, and a growing fire that no one could put out. The birth of the National Assembly within that tense uncertainty. A few voices stood tall. One of them was Emmanuel Joseph Size, a priest not of privilege but of purpose. He had written a small pamphlet titled, "What is the Third Estate?" His answer was clear: everything. To him, the Third Estate was not a part of the nation. It was the nation. And that idea, once spoken, could not be unspoken. Another was Mirabeau, a noble by birth but a revolutionary in spirit. Loud, passionate, and unwavering, he saw what was coming long before others did, and he welcomed it. These men, and many more, began to rally the Third Estate not toward rebellion, but toward rebirth. On June 17, 1789, they made their move. They declared themselves the National Assembly, not a request, not a suggestion, but a statement. They were not simply delegates of one estate. They were representatives of the people, of the nation, of France. It was a quiet declaration written with care, but beneath its calm words was thunder. The Third Estate no longer accepted the idea that power flowed only from royalty or blood. They believed it flowed from the people, their people. And that belief, spoken aloud in a gilded hall meant for ceremony, marked the beginning of a new age. The other estates watched with unease. Some clergy, especially those from poorer parishes, began to drift toward the assembly. A few nobles followed, but many remained frozen, unsure whether to resist or reform. The king, too, hesitated. His silence gave space. And in that space, the National Assembly began to grow. They did not yet have weapons or laws. They did not yet hold the palace, but they had something stronger: purpose. For the first time, a group of ordinary men had stood up and declared that they were France. And from that moment on, they were no longer just the Third Estate. They were something more. The tennis court oath 3 days later, on June 20th, the doors to the Third Estate's chamber were locked. Some said it was for repairs. Others whispered of sabotage. Whatever the truth, it felt like a dismissal. Excluded from their own hall, the National Assembly wandered the palace grounds, uncertain but undeterred. They needed a space, any space, to gather. And so they found it, a long, narrow room used for indoor tennis. It was nothing like the halls of Versailles. No chandeliers, no gold, no guards. Just wooden floors and white walls, echoing with the sound of feet and whispered doubt. But here, in this humble place, something sacred happened. They stood side by side, hundreds of men, their coats damp from the summer heat. They raised their hands. They swore an oath, not to the king, not to the church, not even to one another, but to an idea. They vowed not to separate until France had a constitution, until the nation had a voice written in law, until the people had more than promises. They would have rights. There were no trumpets. No paintings were made that day. Only later would. Artists imagined the moment, fists raised, brows furrowed, France reborn. But in truth, it was a moment of sweat and silence, a stillness filled with courage, a collective breath before the long march forward. The tennis court oath did not overthrow a king. It did not change a law, but it drew a line across time. Before that day, power was inherited. After that day, power was claimed. And once claimed, it would never return quietly to the crown. Power begins to shift. The ripples from that oath moved quickly. Word spread across France of the assembly, of the oath, of the locked doors and open hearts. In churches, priests began to question loyalty to old hierarchies. In salons, nobles debated whether to join or resist. And at court, the king began to lose sleep. At first, Louis XVI tried to control the movement. He called for order. He asked the estates to reunite, but the assembly refused. They were no longer an estate. They were the nation. When words failed, the king turned to force. Troops gathered near Versailles. Rumors of a crackdown began to swirl, but the people watched. And they did not wait. Crowds gathered in Paris, in Lyon, in every province. The army, many of whom were poor men themselves, hesitated. Would they fire on those who looked like their families? Would they fight a France that now stood on its feet? More members from the First and Second Estates began to join the assembly. Some came quietly. Others came with speeches, with conviction, with regret. The National Assembly grew not by conquest, but by gravity. It pulled people in, drawn not by fear, but by hope. A new France began to take shape, not in laws or borders yet, but in imagination. People began to believe that the world could be different, that power could come from below as well as above, that voices long ignored could become the soul of the nation. The king, still unsure, gave way. He allowed the assembly to continue. He hoped it might fade, might falter, might fold under pressure. But it did not. It stood, day after day, gathering strength, gathering names, gathering history. And so, without bloodshed, without swords, without revolts in the street, yet France began to tilt. Not in fury, but in focus, not in chaos, but in courage. It was no longer the monarchy alone that defined the nation. A new force had entered the hall, and it spoke not in decree, but in the steady, rising voice of the people. Chapter 5. The Fall of the Bastille. The city of Paris stirred beneath a heavy sky in July of 1789. Summer brought heat, but it also brought something sharper, tension that hung in the air like smoke before a fire. News had spread that Jacques Necker, the finance minister seen by many as a friend to the people, had been dismissed by the king. His removal felt like a message, and that message was fear. If even Necker could be silenced, then who would be next? Meanwhile, soldiers appeared. At the edge of the city, thousands of them. Regiments with foreign names, uniforms, and unfamiliar commands gathered just beyond reach, sent by the crown under the shadow of order. Officially, they were there to keep peace. But in Paris, where bread was scarce and tempers high, they were seen as a blade waiting to fall. Rumors ran wild. Whispers in markets turned into warnings. It was said that the king was preparing to shut down the National Assembly, that arrests were coming, that executions might follow. Whether these things were true didn't matter. In times of fear, belief moves faster than fact. The people of Paris, craftsmen, shopkeepers, apprentices, women in aprons, boys in patched shirts began to gather, not in organized protest, but in something deeper, a swell of shared alarm. In cafes and alleyways, in churches and public squares, the question passed from mouth to mouth. What are we going to do? What began as panic began to turn into something else. Action, movement. The people of Paris did not wait for permission. They would not ask for safety. They would create it. Together, arming the crowd on the morning of July 14th, the sun rose over a city already awake. Crowds filled the streets, not yet rioting, but restless. The National Assembly was still in session, but far from the capital. Here, in Paris, people moved with a different rhythm, one born not of politics, but of necessity. They needed to act. They needed to protect themselves. And to do that, they needed weapons. Their eyes turned toward Les Invalides, a large military hospital and retirement home for veterans. It held muskets, thousands of them, but no powder. Still, it was the first step. A crowd marched through the streets and arrived at its gates. No royal troops stopped them. No orders were given to resist. The people flooded in, and soon the armory had been emptied. They now held firearms, but no fire. They had muskets, but not the gunpowder needed to use them, and they knew where it was kept. The Bastille. The Bastille was an old fortress in eastern Paris. Once a royal stronghold, it had become a prison, though by 1789 it held only 7 inmates. It was not feared for its prisoners, but for what it represented. To the people, the Bastille was not a building. It was a symbol of absolute monarchy, of decisions made behind walls, of silence imposed by force. The crowd that had armed itself now moved toward the Bastille. Some carried muskets, others carried pikes or tools. Many carried nothing but conviction. There was no central leader, no planned assault. It was a movement born in a moment, shaped by years of frustration and days of fear. They did not come as soldiers, but they came with purpose. Storming the fortress, the Bastille loomed with thick stone walls and high towers. Its cannons faced outward, unmanned. A small group of guards stood inside, led by Governor Bernard-René Delaunay. He had no orders to open fire, but no clear path to peace either. The crowd outside grew. Some shouted for the gunpowder. Others pleaded for calm. Still others climbed walls and gates, trying to force a way in. Negotiations began, shouts across barriers. Notes passed, pauses filled with tension. But fear moves quickly. A few shots rang out, no one is sure from where. Chaos followed. Muskets fired. Smoke rose. The bridge was lowered by the crowd or broken under pressure. Accounts differ. But the people surged forward. The assault was messy and untrained. Men fired from rooftops. Cannons dragged from the streets were used against the fortress. Inside, soldiers fired down. For hours, Paris became a battlefield without generals. Blood spilled in the square. The wounded were carried away. Still, the people did not retreat. By afternoon, the guards surrendered. Governor Delaunay was captured, beaten, and eventually killed. His head was paraded through the streets on a pike. It was a gruesome symbol, but for many, it felt like justice after centuries of voiceless suffering. The monarchy's walls had cracked, and the people had seen their own power for the first time. The Bastille was not a major military target. It was not taken by strategy. It did not change the city's defenses, but what it did change forever was belief. The idea that power could fall, that the people could rise, that fear could shift from those below to those above. A day that echoed forever. That night, the streets of Paris glowed with firelight, not from flames of destruction, but from the warmth of something new awakening. News of the fall of the Bastille spread faster than carriages could carry it. Across France, bells rang. Letters flew. And for the first time in years, the people believed that change was not only possible, it had begun. In Versailles, the king asked if it was a revolt. "No, sire," came the reply. "It is a revolution." Louis XVI did not yet grasp the full meaning, but the nation had shifted beneath his feet. The walls of royal authority had been touched. The silence of oppression had been broken. The people had claimed a voice, and that voice would not return to stillness. July 14th was remembered instantly. It was not planned as a holiday, but it became one. Not just a date, but a turning point. Not for what was gained, but for what was left behind the myth of untouchable monarchy. The idea that fear must always flow downward. The lie that only kings could shape history. The stones of the Bastille were pulled down piece by piece. Some were sent across the country, fragments of a moment frozen in time. Others were used to build bridges, statues, and memorials. What had once been a prison became a foundation not of stone, but of spirit. To storm the Bastille was not to conquer a fortress. It was to tear open history and step inside. It was to say that dignity matters, that voices count, that fear is not destiny, and that even the mightiest towers can fall when the people rise. That day, the people of Paris wrote something new into the story of France. Not in ink, but in action. Not in speeches, but in courage. And though revolutions would rise and fall in the years to come, though leaders would change and blood would spill, that first breath of freedom, raw and chaotic, brave and bright, never faded. It echoed through the streets, through the years, through the world. And it began with a gate, a wall, and a crowd that no longer wished to be quiet. Chapter 6. The Women Who Walked. The scent of unrest did not begin in the halls of politics or the dusty chambers of Versailles. It began in bakeries, or rather, in the absence of bread. Paris in the autumn of 1789 was a city cracking under the weight of hunger. Markets stood nearly empty. What little bread remained was often too expensive, hoarded, or spoiled. Women, those who bought, baked, and fed their families, were the first to feel its sharpest edge. Hunger did not whisper. It screamed through the stomachs of children and echoed in the aching limbs of mothers. In neighborhoods where laughter had once drifted from windows, there was now silence. Tension simmered in the air like a storm waiting to break. On the morning of October 5th, a spark caught fire. In a marketplace in Paris, a woman, angry, tired, and desperate, raised her voice. Then another, and another. The crowd grew quickly, pulled together not by politics, but by pain. They carried wooden spoons, iron pots, and kitchen knives. Some were barefoot. Many wore aprons still dusted with flour. They had no banners, only grief, and one demand: bread. They marched first to City Hall, voices rising in a harmony of outrage. It was not a parade. It was not a riot. It was a procession of the forgotten. Housewives, servants, washerwomen, all carrying more than tools. They carried the weight of empty cupboards and dying hope. In their eyes burned a fire stronger than anger. It was love twisted by starvation into resolve. Versailles was their goal, not because it was symbolic, but because that's where the bread had gone. To the king, to the queen, to the feasts that continued while babies cried from hunger. It was not revenge they sought. It was nourishment. It was fairness. It was survival. By midday, the crowd had swelled. From market stalls to narrow alleyways, women joined arm in arm. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then cold and steady. But it did not scatter them. Instead, it baptized them. They moved as one body, soaked, fierce, and unyielding. Their cries filled the streets. Bread, bread for our children. A simple plea, louder than any political speech. By late afternoon, Paris had become the womb of a new movement. And it marched not with soldiers, but with mothers. The march to Versailles, the road to Versailles stretched nearly 12 miles, long and damp under a low gray sky. Mud clung to feet and hems. The rain had softened the earth, but not the spirits of those who walked upon it. The march, at first a spontaneous eruption, now took form. Lafayette, the commander of the National Guard, reluctantly agreed to follow. He did not lead them. He followed them because nothing could stop them. Along the road, the line of women became a river. They sang songs that once echoed in kitchens and taverns, now turned into hymns of purpose. There were no uniforms among them, only skirts heavy, with rain and shawls pulled tight against the wind. They walked for hours past villages, past fields, past the indifference of noble lands. They walked not to threaten, but to be seen, to be heard, to say, "We exist, and we are starving." Children were carried on backs. Elders leaned on younger arms. Some clutched rosaries. Others, makeshift weapons. One woman reportedly dragged a cannon. All the way from Paris, her hands were blistered, her arms trembling, but her eyes never left the road. In every face, the same expression, not rage but resolve. By nightfall, Versailles rose before them, its golden gates gleaming through the mist, the palace lights burning as if unaware of the storm arriving at their doors. Some women wept at the sight, exhausted yet alive with purpose. They had arrived. They had walked. And now they would wait. Outside the palace, they camped. Wet, cold, but undeterred. They built fires. They fed their children what little they had. They sang songs into the dark. Guards looked on from behind walls. Inside, the king dined. But outside, history gathered around the flames. The next morning, they would push further. The king's reluctant return. The dawn of October 6th came quietly. A mist hung over the palace lawns. But inside Versailles, fear began to settle in. The women had not left. They had spent the night in the rain, their numbers growing with each hour. Word spread quickly of hunger, of demand, of grief. And yet the king hesitated. Louis XVI, still struggling to grasp the depth of the people's desperation, hoped perhaps they would go home. But hunger does not sleep, and it does not forget. Tensions flared when some guards fired into the air to disperse the crowd. A few women surged forward, demanding entry. The palace gates, symbols of luxury and control, now felt fragile. Several guards were overrun. One was killed. For a brief moment, chaos broke through the calm. Yet even then, the mob's violence was not wild. It was focused. Their cry was unchanged. The king to Paris. They wanted bread. They wanted the crown closer to their suffering. Not in golden rooms, but in the streets that starved, Lafayette arrived again, this time to urge the king to act. A compromise was offered. Louis would go to Paris, not as a concession of defeat, but as a gesture of understanding. But the people no longer saw gestures as enough. They saw the king not as a sovereign, but as someone who must now answer to the hungry. That afternoon, the royal carriage emerged. The king and queen rode slowly, guarded but not alone. Around them, thousands walked, some still barefoot, many singing, some holding loaves of bread aloft, taken from the royal kitchens. The people marched not behind their monarch, but beside him, and in doing so, they reversed the very meaning of power. The king was no longer untouchable. He was now among them. No longer seated high above, but surrounded. The return to Paris was solemn, not triumphant. The bells rang. Crowds watched in silence. This was not victory. It was a shift. Something deep and quiet, a knowing. The king who had once lived in splendor now lived in the city of his people. Not in grandeur, but in the gravity of their pain. The seeds of revolution deepen. The women return to their homes not as protesters, but as legends. Their feet had torn through mud and history. They had crossed the divide between palace and poverty, and they had not only been heard, they had been obeyed. The king lived among them, and that changed everything. News of the march spread like a wind through France. In every town, people spoke in whispers and shouts. Did you hear? The women brought the king to Paris. It was not just an act of protest. It was a revelation. If hunger could walk to power, if mothers could move kings, then perhaps the throne itself was not as sacred as it seemed. The myth of royal divinity had cracked not from war, but from walking. This moment planted something deep in the soil of France, an idea that could not be unlearned. Power did not sit only in crowns or gilded halls. It pulsed in markets, in homes, in hands calloused by work. It lived in the voices of the poor. And most clearly, it lived in the women who had risen not to destroy, but to deliver death. They had not carried swords. They had carried sorrow. They had not demanded gold. They had demanded bread. And in doing so, they had turned the tide of a nation. They had rewritten the roles of women, of power, of revolution itself. As the monarchy settled uneasily into Paris, the city watched, eyes sharpened, hearts stirred. The people had seen themselves reflected in a line of soaked, tired, determined women walking 12 miles for justice. And once seen, they could not be unseen. The seeds had been planted. The soil was ready. And from the footsteps of those mothers would rise something far greater than they could have imagined. Chapter 7. The Death of Privilege. It was a summer night unlike any France had seen before. Not because of thunder in the skies, but because of the thunder in the hearts of men. Inside the National Assembly, candles flickered against marble walls. As nobles in silks and soldiers in boots sat shoulder to shoulder with merchants, lawyers, and dreamers, The heat hung low, not only in the air, but in the silence between speeches. The fall of the Bastille had broken the illusion that the people were powerless. Now, the very ground beneath the aristocracy trembled. France was burning, not in flames, but in ideas. Across the countryside, peasants had begun to rise. They stormed manors. They destroyed tax records. They refused to pay the old feudal dues that had bound their families for generations. Fear trickled upward. The nobles knew their privileges, once guarded by the king, no longer had a wall to protect them. So on the night of August 4th, 1789, they made a choice. One by one, they stood. And one by one, they surrendered. A viscount spoke first. He renounced his right to collect feudal dues. Another followed, giving up hunting rights, special courts, and noble tax exemptions. Then another. Then another. A bishop laid down the church's claim to mandatory tithes. A duke surrendered his hereditary privileges. They stood not as heroes, but as survivors. They saw that the old system could not bend, it would break. And so they unfastened it, piece by piece. The mood inside the assembly shifted from tense to unreal. Applause broke out, cheers, some wept. Others stared in disbelief. They were watching the end of a world, an invisible world made of titles, rights, and customs no one had ever questioned out loud. Now in the span of one night, it was unraveling. Outside, the people would not know until the next morning. But inside, the past had been buried. In that room, amid parchment and heat, feudalism was quietly pronounced dead. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, less than 3 weeks later, on August 26th, the Assembly gave the new France its voice. It came not as a shout or a speech, but as a document, a scroll of 26 lines that would shake monarchs across Europe and light fires across the world. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was not law. It was more powerful than law. It was promised. In those carefully chosen words, France named her new values: liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The Declaration began not with policy, but with poetry. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It was not just a sentence, it was a sunrise. No longer would rights be a gift from kings. No longer would freedom be a luxury for the elite. These were now human rights, tied not to birth, but to being. Every man, simply by being alive, was worthy of dignity, protection, and voice. The document flowed like a river, clear, strong, and steady. It declared that law must be the same for all, that officials must be held accountable, that no one could be arrested or punished without reason. It opened the door to freedom of speech, religion, and press. And most boldly of all, it placed the nation above the monarchy. Sovereignty no longer came from God, it came from the people. But this was not a dream scribbled in the dark. It was a mirror reflecting what France longed to become. Every line spoke to centuries of silence. And though it did not erase pain or poverty, it gave something that had been missing: hope written down. The Declaration would echo far beyond France. Years later, its ideas would reach Haiti, Latin America, and beyond. It inspired Jefferson, awed philosophers, and frightened emperors. Because in just a few lines, it did what swords and revolts could not. It gave revolution a soul, new laws, new lives. As the ink dried on the Declaration, its spirit began to take root in law. This was no longer a rebellion of crowds and barricades. It was a reconstruction. Brick by brick, law by law, the old order crumbled, and a new France emerged, one that no longer bowed to ancient names or sacred taxes. Feudal dues, once paid in crops and coins, were abolished. The priest no longer demanded tithes from the poor. The noble no longer claimed a peasant's harvest. In the countryside, families looked at their fields differently. They no longer belonged halfway to a lord who had never stepped foot in them. Now, they could plant for their children, not for a tax collector. Justice changed too. Where once there were separate courts for nobles, clergy, and commoners, there now stood one system. And under it, all men were equal not in wealth, but in law. A peasant could be heard in court. A merchant could appeal. A noble could be judged. The law had become something new, not a weapon, but a shield. For women, the law remained distant. Their voices had not yet reached the assemblies. But they watched. They remembered. And they waited. Education began to shift. New schools emerged, focused not on Latin prayers or noble customs, but on reading, writing, and civic understanding. A child born into a farmhouse now had a path narrow, but visible, to become a teacher, a clerk, even a politician. The world had not become equal overnight, but for the first time, the door had been opened. And that made all the difference. Taxes, too, were reimagined. No longer would the rich be exempt while the poor carried the weight of the kingdom. Now, all were expected to contribute. A simple idea, but one that turned centuries of injustice upside down. And yet, for all the legal victories, daily life remained hard. Bread was still scarce. Jobs were still few. But the people carried something they had never had before: legal dignity. They could not eat the Declaration, but they could believe in it. The dream and the divide, even in the glow of change, shadows crept in. France had torn down the old house. But what would it build in its place? Some in the assembly believed the revolution had gone far enough. The king was still alive. The church still stood. The nobles had stepped back. Now was the time to pause, to steady the ship, but others disagreed. They looked at the world around them and saw more chains to break. They asked, if rights are universal, why are women still excluded? Why is the king still on his throne? Why did the poor still starve while the wealthy remain protected? A divide open not on maps but in minds. Moderates wanted balance. Radicals wanted purity. One side wore powdered wigs, the other wore red caps. And between them stood a fragile new republic, still finding its voice. The people, too, were divided. Some saw progress. Others saw betrayal. In the villages, rumors spread. In the cafes of Paris, arguments flared. Was the revolution being hijacked? Was it too soft or too cruel? And as the debate deepened, the dream began to blur. Equality had been promised, but it came slowly and not for all. Liberty had been declared, but it required order, and order was slipping. Fraternity had been preached, but suspicion was growing louder than love. Still, through it all, one thing was clear. France would never return to what it was. The old privileges were gone. The titles, the exemptions, the invisible ladder of class all had been shaken. A new France had been born, not in full, but in outline. And though the paper might tear, the ideas it carried would live on. In the quiet of law books and the noise of the streets, the revolution breathed. It stumbled. It soared. And as it moved forward, It left behind a tomb that needed no headstone, only a memory. Here lay privilege. Died August 4th, 1789. Cause of death. The people awakened. Chapter 8. The Crown and Chains. When the royal carriage rolled into Paris in October of 1789, it was met not with cheers of adoration, but with the heavy silence of a city watching closely. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had left behind the vast gardens of Versailles. In exchange, they were moved into the heart of Paris to the Tuileries Palace, a grand, aging building that now served as both their residence and their cage. From the outside, the palace still shimmered with royal dignity. Its large windows reflected the light of the Seine, and its rooms were lined with tapestries and gilded mirrors. But behind those walls, things had changed. There were no longer court festivities or masked balls. The halls were quiet. The staff had been reduced. Armed guards patrolled the grounds at all hours. The king and queen still wore fine clothes. They still dined from silver plates. But every movement was watched. Every visitor was approved or denied. The Tuileries was not a home. It was a waiting room for history. To the public, this arrangement seemed like a compromise. The king remained in place, but under supervision. Yet for the royal family, it was suffocating. Gone was the distance that once separated ruler from ruled. Now they were surrounded by the city, by its noise, its anger, and its eyes. Marie Antoinette, once the queen of parties and performance, found herself restless. She paced the halls, wrote letters in secret, and played with her children in gardens that no longer felt safe. Louis tried to appear calm, spending hours in his study, reading, pretending to govern. But neither could deny the truth. The revolution had moved into their lives, and they could not move away from it. Each morning, the streets below the palace, filled with citizens watching, waiting, whispering. The monarchy, once untouchable, now sat behind windows like a painting in a frame, still visible, still dignified, but no longer free. The Constitution of 1791, while the royal family adjusted to life inside the Tuileries, the National Assembly continued its work. They were building something entirely new, a system never before seen in France. It was careful, cautious, and bold all at once. They were not yet ready to remove the king, but they were ready to redefine him. In September of 1791, their vision became real. The Constitution of 1791 was passed. France, for the first time, became a constitutional monarchy. It was a compromise born from the need to keep balance while moving forward. Under this new arrangement, Louis XVI remained king, but his power was now limited by law. He could no longer rule by divine right. Instead, his authority came from the people. He would govern alongside an elected legislature. He could delay laws but not block them forever. He could speak but not command. And in perhaps the most symbolic change, his title was altered. He was no longer King of France, a phrase that echoed centuries of ownership and divine rule. He was now King of the French. A small change in words, a monumental change in meaning. He was no longer the master of a land. He was the servant of a people. The Constitution was celebrated with music, festivals, and hopes that a new era had begun. Moderates rejoiced. They believed France had found its middle path, preserving tradition while embracing liberty. But beneath the celebration, Cracks remained. Louis had signed the Constitution, but not with joy. He had done so under pressure. To many, he appeared compliant, but others sensed the truth. His heart was not in it. The crown still sat on his head, but it no longer fit. The constitutional monarchy was fragile from the start. It required trust. It demanded that the king and the people walk together. But trust in this new France was a fading light. The king's secret doubts behind the locked doors of the Tuileries, far from the public gaze, the king and queen began to plan. They had smiled in public. They had played their roles. But inside, fear and resentment grew. Louis did not believe the revolution would last. He did not believe that the people were capable of governing themselves. And he no longer believed he was safe. Marie Antoinette, more forceful than her husband, was certain they needed to escape. She urged him to act. And so they did. In the shadows, letters were written. Secret messages were sent to allies beyond France's borders. Loyal nobles, foreign rulers, even the king's own brothers, many of whom had already fled, received word. The royal family needed help. They wanted restoration. Plans were drawn. A carriage would take them by night. Disguises would be worn. Military support could be gathered on the other side. Once beyond Paris, the king believed he could rally loyal troops and reclaim control, but the plan was flawed. The carriage was large and slow. The royal family was recognized. Near the town of Varennes, they were stopped. Soldiers and citizens surrounded them. There would be no escape. The flight to Varennes, as it came to be called, changed everything. When the family was brought back to Paris, they were not met with anger. They were met with silence, a silence heavier than any shout. The people no longer pitied their king. They no longer saw him as a reluctant partner in change. They saw him for what he was, a man who had tried to run, trust shattered. The image of a constitutional monarchy cracked. And though Louis remained in the palace, he would never again be seen the same way. Paris watches. In the weeks after the failed escape, the mood in Paris shifted, not with sudden violence, but with a deepening stillness. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, the kind that hums beneath the surface of daily life. The king had tried to flee. The people had watched him return. And now they waited. Crowds still gathered outside the Tuileries, but their expressions had changed. They no longer looked up with curiosity. Now they looked with suspicion. The thin royal family had betrayed the fragile trust of a city that had offered them a second chance. And Paris, with its memory long and patience short, began to stir. In cafes and taverns, voices grew louder. In newspapers, writers sharpened their pens. The king's actions had made a clear statement, even if he would not say it aloud. He did not believe in the revolution. And so, the revolution would have to decide what to do with him. New political clubs gained power. The Jacobin, who believed the revolution had not gone far enough, gained followers. The idea of a republic, once seen as too radical, began to feel possible, even necessary. Louis, now watched by guards and distrusted by his people, carried out his duties like a shadow of his former self. He read documents. He appeared at ceremonies. But the weight of what had been lost could be seen in his shoulders, in his silence. Marie Antoinette, once fiercely proud, now turned inward. Her letters became more desperate, her gaze more distant. The palace no longer echoed with plans of escape. It echoed with the awareness that time was running out. Outside, the city pulsed. The streets remained calm, but the calm was tense. A quiet revolution is not a finished one. And in the summer of 1791, Paris knew this story was not yet over. King still wore his crown, but it no longer glittered. It no longer commanded. It simply remained like a chain no one had yet decided to break. Chapter 9. The Flight to Varennes. There are moments in history when silence speaks louder than any speech. In the warm evenings of early summer 1791, inside the Tuileries Palace, that silence grew heavier with each passing hour. Louis XVI once, an absolute monarch, now lived as a shadow behind guarded walls. Marie Antoinette, once the most dazzling figure of Europe's courts, now paced corridors not lined with admirers but with watchmen. Every movement was observed. Every letter weighed. They still wore silk. They still sat upon a throne. But the air around them had changed. It was tighter, colder, filled with doubt. And in that air, an idea began to form, an escape. The plan had to be flawless. Nothing else would do. The family would leave Paris quietly under the cover of night. Disguises were chosen. The king would play the role of a humble servant, Marie. Antoinette a governess, the children costumed as commoners. Accompanying them would be loyal staff, each assigned a false identity. The carriage was commissioned, large, covered, and padded to conceal its passengers. Passports were prepared under assumed names. Their destination, Montmedy, a stronghold. Near the eastern border, where royalist troops still waited in quiet loyalty. Timing, as always, was critical. The family would leave late at night on June 20th. They would follow a carefully plotted route, stopping only at designated relay points to change horses. It was meant to be swift, unnoticed, and complete. Once safe across the border, the king believed he could negotiate from a position of strength, not to crush the revolution, but to contain it. To guide it, perhaps, back to something that resembled order. But fear is a poor navigator, and uncertainty an even worse clock. The queen hesitated over the departure hour, waiting for all to be in place. Precious minutes slipped by. The coach, large and heavy, would prove difficult to manage. Even before the wheels began to turn, time had already started to run out. And yet, just before midnight, the royal family slipped quietly from the palace. They passed guards who looked the other way. They entered their carriage, hearts pounding, breath shallow. Behind them, Paris slept. Ahead, the road to Varennes waited, winding, quiet, and dangerous. The road to Varennes, the journey through the countryside, unfolded beneath a dark sky stitched with stars. The coach moved slowly, creaking along dusty roads and cobbled paths. It was not a royal carriage in appearance, but its size and style still drew attention. The king, heavy-set and tall, was not easily disguised. The queen, her features known across France, sat still in the dim light. The children, sleepy and confused, whispered quietly between them. With each turn of the wheel, Paris fell further behind, and with it, the illusion of safety grew stronger. But danger traveled with them. Delays at horse relay stations caused worry. In some towns, the horses were not ready on time. In others, the drivers seemed suspicious. The large, luxurious coach could not slip through unnoticed. Local townspeople, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, postmasters took notice. It was not fear that exposed the plan. It was familiarity. The king's face was everywhere, on coins, in pamphlets, in portraits hung in village halls. His likeness was known even to those who had never seen a palace dot in the town of Saint-Menehould. A postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouot stared hard at the man in the coach. Something about the posture, the profile, the deep, uncertain eyes. He remembered an engraving of the king he had once studied. He began to suspect. Drouot followed. On horseback, he raced through the night ahead of the coach toward the next town, Varennes. The royal family, unaware they had been recognized, continued on. They were tired, nervous, but still hopeful. The road grew darker. The towns grew quieter. Their escape, just hours from completion, now lay in the hands of a stranger who believed in the revolution more than in the crown dot in Varennes. Drouot arrived just minutes before the royal carriage. He alerted the local authorities and the National Guard. When the coach pulled into town, it was met not with resistance, but with readiness. Townspeople, uncertain at first, gathered quickly. The local magistrate hesitated, but the evidence was clear. The passports, though forged, matched faces too familiar to be dismissed. They were stopped. The journey was over. In the early morning light, the king revealed his identity. He did not fight, he did not beg. But in that moment, something shifted, not just for him, but for France. The king, once believed to be chosen by God, had tried to flee his own people. And now, caught not by generals but by citizens, he was no longer a ruler. He was a passenger in someone else's story. Brought back in silence, the carriage turned back toward Paris. The same wheels that had carried hopes of escape now moved through fields of judgment. The royal family sat stiffly, their disguises discarded. Outside, the landscape passed slowly, familiar now but colder. The summer sun rose gently across the horizon, but its warmth did not reach the carriage. It was a procession not of royalty, but of reckoning. The news of the failed escape spread quickly. By the time the carriage reached the outskirts of the city, thousands had gathered. They did not bring torches. They did not bring weapons. They brought silence. Street after street, the coach rolled through walls of stillness. Men stood with arms crossed. Women held their children close. Bakers paused mid-delivery. Shoemakers stopped in their doorways. Paris watched, but it did not cheer. It did not weep. It simply stared. The silence spoke everything. It said, "We trusted you." It said, "You ran from us." It said, "You are no longer who you were." The National Assembly, fearing unrest, declared that the king had been kidnapped. A convenient lie meant to preserve calm. But the people were not fooled. They had seen too much, heard too much. The illusion of partnership had vanished. The king had tried to leave them behind, not in words, but in action. Back at the Tuileries, the family was returned to their palace prison. The guards were doubled. The exits watched more closely. The queen looked out through barred windows. The king returned to his desk, but not to power. The silence of Paris continued, now inside the palace itself. What had returned to the city was not a monarch, but a symbol, a reminder that even kings, once they turn their backs on the people, do not walk freely again. The mask falls, the escape changed everything, not just in politics, but in hearts. The mask of loyalty, worn carefully since 1789, fell away. The monarchy, once seen as a flawed institution worth preserving, was now seen as a threat. It had revealed its fear, its distance, its disinterest in the people's journey. And that made it dangerous. The radicals in Paris felt their cause validated. The Jacobins, who had long called for the end of the monarchy, now found louder voices beside them. The moderates, once hopeful for balance, now wrestled with betrayal. The idea of a republic, once whispered only in the corners of taverns, now echoed in city halls and pamphlets. Newspapers painted the king not as a father of the nation, but as a traitor to his children. Political cartoons showed the royal family in flight, depicted as animals, cowards, and exiles. The public, once unsure of its path, began to march more clearly toward a future without a crown. But change comes slowly, even when momentum builds quickly. The assembly did not yet move to dethrone the king. They hoped still to manage, to stabilize, to delay collapse. But France, as a people, had already made a quiet decision. The republic was no longer a theory. It was a horizon. The king remained at the Tuileries, but he no longer ruled. He signed papers. He made appearances. But the people did not listen. The silence had become louder than speeches. The palace, though grand, felt hollow. The crown, though worn, no longer sparkled, and in the minds of the citizens, a question took root. If a king could flee his people once, what was to stop him from trying again? And if he could not be trusted, how could he remain? The answer would not come all at once. But it had begun. The monarchy, once revered, now stood beneath a shadow cast by its own actions. The mask had fallen. The face beneath was no longer fit to lead. And so, France stood still, holding its breath, watching its future come into view. Chapter 10: War and the Rise of the Radicals. The revolution had broken the crown, shattered old laws, and changed the rhythm of everyday life. But it had not yet been tested by war. That would come soon. And when it did, it would burn away whatever. Softness still remained in the spirit of change. Beyond France's borders, the thrones of Europe watched uneasily. Kings and emperors had seen what happened in Paris, and they feared the fire might spread. If the French people could remove their king, what would stop their own subjects from trying the same? In their courts, behind velvet curtains and crystal chandeliers, the language of diplomacy shifted. The revolution was not just France's problem now, it was everyone's. Then came the declaration of Pillnitz. In August of 1791. The kings of Austria and Prussia issued a warning. They declared that the royal family of France should be restored to full power, and if harm came to Louis XVI or Marie Antoinette, they would act. It was a message dressed in polite language, but its meaning was clear. The revolution must stop. Or the sword would speak, but France had already changed too much to be intimidated. The people no longer looked to kings with reverence. They saw foreign threats not as warnings, but as challenges. And so, France responded with pride, with defiance. With war. In April of 1792, the French Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria. Prussia followed shortly after, joining the cause to defend monarchy. The revolution had become international. What began as an internal reckoning now opened its gates to global consequences. At first, the war was chaos. France had disbanded much of its traditional army. Officers had fled. Supplies were scarce. Training was uneven. The soldiers who marched were young, untested, and driven more by passion than by skill. And yet, they sang the Marseillaise with trembling voices and clenched fists. They believed they were defending not land, but liberty itself. But hope alone cannot win battles. Early defeats came swiftly. Towns fell. Borders trembled. The enemies of France crept closer, and the revolution found itself trapped not by swords alone, but by fear, the Gerandons and the Jacobins inside the government. As bullets flew across borders, words flew even faster across benches and chambers. The revolution, once united in its cry for change, now fractured into factions. Two voices began to rise above the others. The Girondins were the revolution's moderates. Idealistic and eloquent, they believed in measured change, constitutional reform, and preserving some order amid the storm. They supported the war, thinking it would spread liberty and bind the people together. War, they believed, would prove the revolution's righteousness. Opposite them stood the Jacobins, fierce, unyielding, radical. To the Jacobins, moderation was betrayal. They believed France could not share power with kings foreign or domestic. The monarchy was not a sick tree to be trimmed. It was a rotten root to be dug out. At their core was a man who spoke little but watched everything. Maximilian Robespierre. He did not shout. He did not sway with fashion. But his words, when spoken, landed like stones in still water. He saw the war not as a chance for glory, but as a crucible. France must be purified. Enemies within must be named. And those who stood between revolution and its full promise, whether royalists or moderates, must be removed. As the war worsened, the Jacobin grew stronger. Fear favored the bold, and their boldness had no end. The Girondins still held seats. They still drafted laws, but their grasp was slipping. They had believed the war would save the revolution, but it had only fed its hunger. The people mobilized as Austria and Prussia advanced. The revolution called not just its armies, but its people. And they answered. From the smallest villages to the crowded alleys of Paris, men gathered to enlist. Some wore patched clothes, others still smelled of soil and sweat. Farmers left behind plows. Artisans set down their tools. Even students and poets joined. It was not duty. It was belief. In homes, women gathered cloth to make uniforms. They boiled herbs for medicine, wrote letters to absent sons, and carried water to training camps on the city's edge. They were not sent to the battlefield, but they fought with their hands, their backs, their patience. The war was no longer distant. It was not drawn on maps, but felt in breadlines and backyards. Children noticed the missing fathers at dinner. Market shelves emptied faster. Prices rose. And the singing grew quieter. But still, they held on. In Paris, young men marched through the streets, their boots striking cobblestone in rhythm. They raised makeshift banners. They shouted chants of liberty. The revolution was no longer a hope. It had become a duty shared across age and class. And though many did not return, more stepped forward to replace them. It was not organized. It was not professional. But it was passionate. And it showed a truth France had never known before. A nation could fight not because it was commanded, but because it believed. And yet, belief alone could not stop the fear that crept in with each lost battle, each fleeing ally, each whisper of betrayal inside the capital. A nation in fear. The enemy was not yet inside the gates, but fear was. Rumors spread like wildfire that the Prussians would burn Paris, that the Austrians had spies in every neighborhood, that the king was still plotting, that generals were traitors, that even friends could not be trusted. In this new France, fear did not come in armor, it came in whispers. One neighbor turned against another. Letters were intercepted. Accusations rose without proof. The lines between truth and suspicion blurred. And in that haze, paranoia found its voice. The streets of Paris changed. Faces turned more cautious. Conversation shorter. Political clubs became more intense. Flyers appeared overnight, naming enemies, calling for purity. The revolution, born in hope, now walked a narrow road between courage and collapse. Inside the assembly, voices called for calm. But calm sounded too much like hesitation. And hesitation was now dangerous. The king, still technically in place, became the focus of growing suspicion. His silence felt strategic. His past escape still fresh in memory. Every act, every word, every glance was dissected for signs of betrayal. The people no longer saw him as a ruler. They saw him as a question that needed an answer, and above it all, a new shape cast its long shadow. It stood tall, simple, and cold. The guillotine had not yet claimed its first victim, but it had arrived, set up in Paris as a symbol of justice, as a promise, as a warning. It stood not in rage, but in readiness. France was changing again, not by law, not by vote, but by fear sharpened into resolve. The radicals saw the moment. They felt its weight, and they were not afraid to use it. And so, as the drums of war beat louder and foreign armies drew closer, the revolution looked inward, not to protect, but to purge. What began as a dream of freedom now stood at the edge of a blade, and in the stillness of the city, every citizen held their breath. Chapter 11. The monarchy collapses. In the pale hours of dawn on August 10, 1792, the city of Paris felt like a kettle about to boil over. The streets, already choked with the breath of midsummer, were buzzing with something older than anger, something primal. Word had spread like fire that the people were marching again, but this was no ordinary crowd. This time, it was not a protest. It was a reckoning. From the poor quarters of Paris, thousands began to move. Men armed with muskets, sabers, and pikes. Women with torches and pans. Children tagging along with fearful awe. They surged together, forming a tide of flesh and fury that swept toward the Tuileries Palace. They were not coming to argue. They were coming to end something. The Tuileries stood like a wounded monument, its windows watching silently, its high gates closed as if in denial. Behind them, King Louis XVI remained, still imagining he held power, still hoping to be heard. But outside, the sound of drums, chants, and clanging iron drowned every royal thought. Inside the palace, the Swiss Guards stood in their blood-red uniforms, loyal to their oath but outnumbered by thousands. These men were trained, disciplined, foreign. But they were not God's dot. As the morning grew hot, the gates were battered open, and all caution was lost. The mob surged forward. Shots cracked through the air. Smoke drifted between the hedges of the palace gardens. Bodies fell. Cries rose. The Swiss Guards, cornered and outgunned, held for as long as they could before they were massacred. Some tried to surrender. Others ran. But the mob was not interested in surrender. They killed with purpose, with memory. With a fury that had slept too long, blood pooled in the marble halls of the palace. Statues were pulled down. Mirrors were shattered. The air filled with the screams of the dying, the sobs of the wounded, and the roar of triumph. Royal rooms were turned inside out, looted of paintings and papers and pride. And where was the king? He had hesitated, as he always did. He had been advised to flee, but it was too late. He and his family were escorted through a secret passage and into the legislative assembly nearby, hoping for protection. The assembly, caught in its own fear, placed the royal family under arrest. No one cheered. No one wept. It simply happened, like a door shutting on history. That day, the monarchy did not fall with ceremony or speech. It fell with blood on stone and a silence that followed the screams. In one brutal morning, the palace had been emptied, not just of people, but of meaning. Louis, imprisoned, the royal family was taken to the temple, a cold, looming medieval tower in the heart of Paris. Once a stronghold of knights, it had become something darker, a prison for a fallen crown. The thick walls held no warmth. The iron bars no mercy. Louis, once the King of France, now had no title. He was simply Louis Capet, a name stripped of reverence, worn like a brand. His chambers were small and bare. A bed, a chair, a narrow window that let in the distant sounds of a city that no longer belonged to him. He was watched by guards who did not bow, spoken to by men who no longer waited for orders. Marie Antoinette was confined in the next room, her hair graying, her face thin with fear. Their young children, once the joy of Versailles, now clung to her with wide, silent eyes. The Dauphin, heir to a throne that no longer existed, spent his days drawing on the floor with charcoal. His sister tried to read but often cried. The Queen tried to comfort them, but her own heart was breaking. Louis tried to carry on. He read books of history and philosophy. He taught his son to write. He prayed quietly at night, facing the corner where no one could see. He kept a small diary, noting the weather, the meals, the names of visitors. But the days grew longer, the isolation deeper, the hope thinner. Outside, the world had changed. Letters Louis tried to send were intercepted. Allies who once whispered of rescue had gone silent or had been executed. The royal family was no longer a symbol of power, but a problem to be solved. Some still wanted justice through trial. Others wanted death, quickly and without delay. Each day, Louis waited for news. Each day, he received nothing. The temple was not a place of chains or torture, but it was colder than either. It was a place of forgetting. And in it, Louis began to vanish, his presence dulled, his voice quieted. He began to move less, speak less, hope less. It was a kind of death before death. A king who watched his world shrink to the size of a cell. The rise of the commune. While the king's world grew smaller, another world was expanding. In the heart of Paris, revolution had taken a new shape. The Paris Commune, formed out of chaos, was now the real power in the capital. The Legislative Assembly had lost control. The people had taken it back. The Commune was not led by calm men in powdered wigs. It was made of radicals, of iron workers, bakers, blacksmiths, and street fighters. They had seen their brothers die at the Bastille, their children go hungry, their voices ignored. And now they had no more patience. Georges Danton, a giant of a man with a booming voice, became their thunder. He did not speak of balance. He spoke of vengeance, of pushing forward without regret. The old order had spilled too much blood. Now the people would spill theirs. Under the commune, terror was not a threat. It was a tool. Priests were arrested. Churches desecrated. Those suspected of royal ties or aristocratic sympathy were dragged from their homes. Trials became shorter. Sometimes there were no trials at all. Committees formed. Lists were made. Paris turned in on itself, neighborhoods spying on neighbors. The prisons filled. The whispers began, whispers of mass killings, of hidden bodies, of rivers running red. And still the commune pushed forward. To many, this was justice. To others, madness. But it was happening all the same. The revolution, once a cry for liberty, had become something darker. A creature of fear, of fire. It devoured not only kings, but those too slow to cheer. And yet, beneath the violence, there was something strange. A new order was taking shape. Uneven, fragile, angry, but real. The city was being remade, not by kings or philosophers, but by its own streets. The monarchy had not only collapsed, it had been replaced. The road to a republic, with the crown shattered and the royal family locked away, France stood on the edge of something never seen before. A nation without a king. The National Convention was called to gather. Delegates came from every corner of the country, many still covered in the dust of travel. They wore no crowns. They held no swords, but they carried something heavier, the responsibility of creating a new France. Inside the tall chamber halls, debates filled the air. What would replace monarchy? What kind of freedom could survive such fury? Could a republic, born in violence, ever hold peace? On September 21st, 1792, after long hours of speech and silence, the convention declared the monarchy abolished. The republic was born not with music, but with a line of ink on paper. That single vote ended centuries of kingship. And outside, the people heard the news. Some cheered, some wept, some simply went on with their day. It was not the celebration of a nation reborn. It was the quiet beginning of something uncertain. For the first time in history, France would not be ruled by birthright, but by law. A radical idea, a dangerous one. The future lay unwritten, full of ghosts and questions. Louis, locked in the temple, would not hear of it until days later. He nodded slowly when told. He said little. There were no royal tears, only silence, and so the kingdom was gone, the palace emptied, the crown rusting in memory. France, raw and trembling, stepped into its new form, not polished, not finished, but alive. The revolution had taken everything, and now it would have to give something back. A republic, yes, but whether it would stand or fall was a story still unfolding in candlelight and blood. Chapter 12. Blood in the Streets. By late summer of 1792, Paris was not simply uneasy, it was terrified. The revolution, once a cry for justice, now stood on the edge of destruction. Word had arrived that the Prussian army, hardened and disciplined, was advancing steadily through the northeast. Fortress towns had fallen, border defenses had crumbled. Verdun, long thought unbreakable, was under siege. The enemy was near. Within the capital, fear spread faster than fire. Every street corner whispered of betrayal. Every alley seemed to hide a spy. It was not only the Prussians that haunted Parisians, it was the thought that royalists, traders and priests might open the gates from within. The idea that, at the hour of invasion, those who still believed in the king would rise and deliver the city back to tyranny. Newspapers stoked the fear. Pamphlets appeared with harsh words and darker suggestions. If France was to survive, they said, it must purge itself of the enemy within. No one said exactly what that meant, but the message hung in the air like smoke. At the same time, the commune of Paris, now radicalized and led by men like Danton and Marat, refused to calm the people. Instead, they fanned the flames. They warned of plots in the prisons. They spoke of hidden daggers and secret letters. They reminded the people that hesitation had cost them dearly before, and that now they must strike first. The Legislative Assembly, paralyzed by indecision and stripped of real authority, watched with dread. No one wanted violence, but no one knew how to stop it. As August turned to September, the air grew heavy. A storm was coming, not of rain, but of rage. And when it broke, there would be no shelter. The massacres begin on the morning of September 2nd, 1792. The bells of Paris rang not for celebration, but for blood. Mobs gathered at the gates of the city's prisons, Abbey, Bicêtre, La Force. They came not with warrants, but with weapons. Axes, swords, clubs, and ropes. They did not come to demand trials. They came to erase doubt. Inside those walls were hundreds of priests who had refused to swear loyalty to the revolution, nobles taken on suspicion, former guards of the king, and many who were simply caught in the chaos of past months. Some were guilty, most were not. All were marked. The killings began with fury. Prisoners were dragged into courtyards, lined against walls, and hacked to death. Some tried to speak. Some begged, some prayed, but the noise drowned all voices. There were no juries, only blades. What began as vengeance quickly became frenzy. In the Abbey prison, a group of prisoners was lined up for what the mob called judgment. A man read off their names as if reading from a list of ghosts. One by one, they were sentenced and then slaughtered. Bodies piled in corners. Blood seeped into the dirt. Windows nearby were shuttered. Families covered their children's ears, but the noise could not be kept out. Over the next 5 days, the slaughter spread. Prisons that once held political detainees became slaughterhouses. Those who protested were pushed aside. Some tried to hide prisoners, but were threatened with death themselves. By the end of the week, over 1,000 people were dead, murdered not by decree, but by neighbors, citizens, former friends. Some victims were known royalists. Others were old men, women, even teenage boys. A few had committed no crime but misfortune. The government did not stop it. In truth, it barely tried. Danton, speaking to the assembly, gave a chilling defense. "Let us be terrible," he said, "so the people may be spared." But there was no sparing. Blood ran in the gutters of Paris. The smell lingered in the air. And still, the city moved on. A nation-divided France woke to the horror, but not with one voice. In the days after the massacres, the country did not come together in mourning, it split deeper apart. Some revolutionary leaders spoke of justice. They said it was the will of the people, the judgment of a betrayed nation. They claimed that the prison killings were necessary, that without them, the enemy would have triumphed from within. These voices, mostly from the Jacobin Club and the Commune, insisted that revolution required force. and that what had happened was brutal, but others were shaken. Moderate revolutionaries, even some supporters of the Republic, recoiled at the violence. Men like Condorcet, Brissac, and Vergniaud did not defend the slaughter. They saw in it a warning, a line that should not have been crossed. These men feared that the revolution was losing its soul. Outside Paris, the massacres sent a different, chill. Provinces that had watched the fall of the monarchy with cautious hope now stared in disbelief. Reports of hacked corpses, of priests murdered while kneeling, of children orphaned by the blade spread like wildfire. Some cities grew fearful of Paris itself. Others began to doubt the revolution entirely. Foreign observers were horrified. Across Europe, monarchs and their citizens read the news with dread. The revolution, once spoken of with curiosity, was now whispered about in fear. The French people, it was said, had become savages. France, they claimed, had lost its humanity. Even within Paris, there were tears. Not all had cheered. Many wept. In secret, some lit candles for the dead. Others stopped going to meetings or kept their voices lower. But no one could claim they didn't know. The line between justice and vengeance had vanished. And with it, the revolution changed. It was no longer just a political movement. It had become something else, something darker. Something irreversible. Memory and regret. The September massacres did not fade from memory. They became a wound stitched into the heart of the revolution, one that never fully healed. In the years that followed, revolutionaries would speak of those days in hushed tones. Even those who had supported the killings began to grow quiet about them. The official records were thin. Few names were written, few numbers exact. But the stories endured, told in whispers, carried in dreams. For the families of the dead, there was no justice. Most received no explanation, no grave, only silence. Some tried to rebuild. Others left Paris entirely, unable to live near the streets where their loved ones had been killed. Historians would later argue over the causes. Was it fear? Was it manipulation by radical leaders? Was it a failure of law or the madness of the mob? In truth, it was all of these things. And more. It was the terror of being surrounded, the fury of betrayal, the breakdown of law, and the quiet decision made by too many to look away. For the revolution, the killings marked a turning point. After September, there would be no return to balance, no peaceful compromise. The days of debate and pamphlets were over. Now came the days of trials without truth, prisons without charges, and executions without end. The reign of terror, though still months away, had already begun in the hearts of the people. The knife had spoken, and it would not fall silent for a long time. Even Robespierre, the man who had come to embody the terror, once said of the massacres, it was a moment of truth, but also of tragedy. Years later, as he faced his own death, he spoke no more of September. But those who watched him fall remembered. And so the revolution, that dream born in hope, now walked through shadows. A city that once celebrated liberty had learned the cost of fear. A people who cried for freedom had tasted its bitterness. And though the sun would rise again over Paris, it would always rise over the memory of that week, a week when reason drowned and blood filled the streets. Chapter 13. Death of a King. By December 1792, the revolution had taken many shapes, some hopeful, others horrifying. But none was more symbolic than what now stood before the nation, the trial of the king. No longer addressed as Louis XVI, he was citizen Louis Capet. No longer above the law, he now stood beneath its weight. For the first time in French history, a monarch would be judged not by God, but by men. The National Convention, formed just months earlier to replace the monarchy, now sat as jury, judge, and executioner. The charges were grave conspiracy against the liberty of the nation, collusion with foreign powers, betrayal of the revolution. The evidence presented spanned letters, secret documents, and the king's own actions before and after the storming of the Bastille. But beyond facts, something deeper stirred in that chamber. This trial was about more than guilt. It was about history, about symbols, about whether a people, newly free, could ever live alongside the memory of a king. Louis sat quietly, dressed in plain clothes. He did not plead for mercy. He answered calmly. He denied betrayal, stating he had acted always for the good of France. His voice, soft and level, contrasted the fury around him. He did not lash out. He did not cry. He was no longer the uncertain ruler of years past. He was something else now, resigned, perhaps, or simply human. When the time came to vote, the convention did so not in groups but one by one. Each man stood and declared his judgment. Over 200 voted for death without delay. Others wished for a stay or imprisonment. A few abstained. The margins were not wide, but they were clear. On January 17, 1793, the verdict was delivered: death. 4 days later, the sentence would be carried out. And so, the king who had once ruled by divine right waited in silence for the blade of the people. January 21, 1793, the morning was cold. Snow had fallen lightly the night before, leaving a thin white dust across the cobblestones. The sky was pale, the air sharp. Paris had woken early at daybreak. A procession left the Temple prison. Louis sat in a small carriage, flanked by guards. Beside him rode a priest, a constitutional clergy member meant to give him comfort. The king had asked for his personal confessor, but was denied. Still, he remained calm, hands resting on his knees, eyes gazing forward as if already beyond this moment. The streets were lined with soldiers, not to celebrate but to contain. They stood shoulder to shoulder, bayonets upright. No one was allowed near the carriage. No one was to speak. Yet behind the wall of steel and silence, crowds had gathered silent, watching. Some wept, some clenched fists. Others simply stared, unable to believe what they were seeing. The path wound slowly toward the Place de la Révolution, once the Grand Place Louis XV. At its center stood the guillotine, tall and wooden, stained with the past. It had been erected many times before, but never for a king. As the carriage arrived, the platform loomed ahead. Louis stepped out without help. He looked up, blinked once, and began to climb the stairs. At the top, he turned to speak. The guards allowed him a moment. He began to address the crowd, declaring that he died innocent, that he forgave those who condemned him, and that he prayed his death would not bring misfortune to France. But his words were cut short by the beating of drums. The crowd could not hear him, or perhaps they were not meant to. He removed his coat and neckcloth. The executioner tied his hands behind his back. A moment later, Louis was placed beneath the blade. The drum stopped, and then it fell. The sound was not loud, but it was final. A single drop of blood marked the end of centuries. A quiet end. There was no scream, no last defiance, only stillness. And then a hush that seemed to press down on the city itself. Louis XVI, King of France, was gone. Not in battle, not in exile, but here, beneath the cold January sky, at the hands of his own people. The executioner held up the severed head. Some in the crowd shouted, "Vive la République!" Others remained silent. A few turned away. Many simply stood, stunned. It was over, and nothing felt quite real. The king's body was placed in a plain wooden coffin and buried in the nearby cemetery of the Madeleine. No great tomb, no marble inscription, just earth and frost. For the revolutionaries, the moment was meant to be justice. But even among them, there was a strange quiet. Something weighty had shifted. They had killed not just a man, but a myth. And in doing so, they had stepped into a new world, one without crowns, but full of questions. Louis's wife, Marie Antoinette, was not told immediately. She remained in her cell at the temple, surrounded by grief and guards. Her children asked where their father was. She had no answer. The revolution, now fully untethered from monarchy, drifted into unfamiliar territory. What lay ahead was unclear, but what lay behind had ended with a blade and a breath. The World Reacts news of the king's execution moved swiftly. Across Europe, bells tolled not in celebration, but in mourning and in warning. Monarchs were shaken, diplomats stunned. The execution of a king, carried out not by rebels in secret, but by the ruling body of a modern state, was something new, something dangerous. In London, public opinion turned sharply against the revolution. The British government, already uneasy, now condemned the violence outright. Trade with France slowed. Voices that had once admired the ideals of liberty and equality now recoiled from the reality of bloodshed. In Spain, Austria, and Prussia, the king's death was seen as proof that France had become a threat not just to itself, but to every throne in Europe. Alliances hardened, war escalated, borders bristled with troops. France would now face not just rebellion at home, but invasion from abroad. Inside France, the reactions were divided. Some celebrated. They saw the execution as the final act of justice, the proof that no one was above the people. But others felt unease. Even those who had supported the Republic now questioned the cost. A monarch had been unmade. But at what price? In small villages, church bells tolled for the king. In cafes and clubs, debates grew sharper. The people had found their voice, but the voice trembled. Even among the revolutionaries, there were those who felt the echo of what had been done. It was one thing to dethrone a king, another to kill him, and so the world shifted, not just in politics, but in spirit. The sacred had been made mortal. The divine right of kings had ended with a human cry. France would go on, but it would never be the same. Chapter 14. The Reign of Terror. After the fall of the monarchy and the death of Louis XVI, France stood hollow and trembling. The revolution had devoured its king, but peace did not follow. In his place came uncertainty, foreign threats, civil unrest, and a deepening fear that the revolution might fail from within. And so, the National Convention created something new, a body meant to protect the people, to shield liberty from its enemies. They called it the Committee of Public Safety. At first, it was small, a handful of men tasked with organizing, defense, and restoring order. but very quickly it grew teeth. The committee could arrest without trial. It could label anyone an enemy of the Republic. It could decide who would live and who would die. And at its center, watching every word, stood Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre had risen not by violence, but by voice. Thin, reserved, and intensely idealistic, he had once been known for his gentleness. But now, he stood as the revolution's most relentless guardian. He believed in virtue, not as softness, but as strength. To Robespierre, to love the people meant to destroy their enemies. And so, the blade was lifted in the name of good. The committee began to guide everything. It wrote new laws, censored newspapers, controlled armies, and watched the streets. Suspicion became a virtue. Mercy, a risk. If the revolution was to be saved, it would be saved by fire. In Robespierre's hands. The Committee of Public Safety was no longer a defense. It was power, cold, certain, and ready to strike. Enemies everywhere, the terror did not fall in one day. It came like nightfall, slow at first, then all at once. What had once been whispers became arrests. What had once been rumors became executions. The prisons filled again. The guillotine, built for a king, now worked for an idea. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, changed everything. Now anyone could be accused of treason. There was no need for evidence. A careless word, a joke, even silence. These could be seen as betrayal. Neighbors turned on each other. Families stopped speaking in their own homes. Fear crept into every corner of Paris, every town and village. It wore many faces. The guillotine stood at the center of the city, its wooden frame soaked with rain and the blood of thousands. Each day, carts rumbled down the cobbled streets, filled with the condemned. They came from every background: nobles, bakers, former revolutionaries, priests, poets, widows. Many died for who they were, others for what they didn't say. The line between guilt and innocence vanished. In 1 month alone, over 1,000 people were executed in Paris. Across France, the toll climbed higher. Each name marked a silence that would never speak again. And still, the crowd watched. Children memorized revolutionary songs. Women sewed red liberty caps. But no one felt safe. The revolution, meant to lift the people, now crushed them under the weight of its own fear. Robespierre stood firm. He believed that terror was justice, swift, clear, necessary. He spoke of virtue, of cleansing corruption, of building a perfect world. But the perfect world came with screams. The festival of reason while the blade fell in the streets. Another transformation was taking place, this one in the soul of France. For centuries, the church had stood alongside the crown. Priests blessed kings, lit candles for saints, and told the people their suffering had meaning. But now, the revolution turned its gaze upon faith. Many revolutionaries saw religion not as light, but as chains. They believed the church had kept the people in darkness, blind to their own power. And so, they set out to erase it. Churches were stripped of icons. Altars were smashed. Statues of saints were pulled down and replaced with busts of philosophers. The Gregorian calendar was abolished. A new calendar was created, one without Sundays, one without saints. Each day had a name for nature: wind, fire, seed, harvest. In Notre Dame Cathedral, once filled with hymns, a strange new ceremony took place. It was the Festival of Reason. The altar was replaced by a stage. A woman, dressed as the goddess of reason, was paraded before the people. Robespierre did not attend. He found it too theatrical, but others cheered. For a moment, reason was the new religion, not faith, but logic, not prayer, but progress. But even this new light grew cold. The goddess of reason did not forgive. She only measured. People who mocked the new cults were arrested. Those who clung to the old faiths were called traitors. Priests were executed. Churches closed. And in the emptiness, confusion grew. What had once been sacred was now forbidden. But nothing had replaced it in the hearts of the people. In time, even this new worship collapsed under its own weight. The Festival of Reason faded, but the silence in the churches remained. France had turned away from heaven, and the sky felt quiet. Virtue and blood. By mid-1794, the revolution stood at a strange crossroads. Its enemies were crushed. Its army had victories. Its laws were in place. But still, the blade did not stop, because Robespierre did not stop. He believed that the Republic could only survive if it remained pure, morally pure, politically pure. But purity, when demanded, becomes a sword. And so, he turned that sword on those around him. Danton, once Robespierre's friend, was now seen as soft, too willing to forgive, too dangerous. He was arrested, tried, and executed. Others followed. Revolutionaries who had once walked beside Robespierre now trembled at his name. To oppose him was to die. Even silence was suspect. And yet, Robespierre spoke of virtue. He gave speeches filled with light, about justice, about truth, about the future. But his hands were red. In June 1794, the Great Terror began. Trials vanished almost entirely. The guillotine worked faster than ever. In 1 month, 1,400 people were executed in Paris alone. It was no longer just fear. It was madness with a method, but the revolution had begun to eat itself. Whispers began to spread that Robespierre was no longer saving the Republic, but destroying it. That his virtue had become cruelty. That his belief in justice was too sharp. On July 27, 1794, the 9th of Thermidor, year 2, Robespierre fell. He was arrested by his own peers. He tried to speak, but his words were drowned in confusion. That night, he was shot in the jaw. The next day, he was taken to the same guillotine where so many had died. His name was not announced with pride. Only relief. With his death, the terror ended. The blade, once lifted in the name of virtue, was lowered, but the scar remained. Chapter 15. The Fall of Robespierre. By the summer of 1794, Maximilien Robespierre stood atop the revolution he had shaped, but the ground beneath him had begun to crack. Once hailed as the incorruptible, a man of unwavering ideals and virtue, Robespierre had become a figure both feared and questioned. He believed he was saving the Republic, saving it from betrayal, from greed, from internal decay. But in his quest for purity, he had pushed too far. And now, even those who once followed him began to doubt his vision. In the beginning, had been one among many, a quiet man with sharp words and a deep sense of moral duty. But as the terror grew and the Committee of Public Safety became more powerful, Robespierre isolated himself. He walked alone through the corridors of the convention. He ate in silence. He rarely consulted others. More and more, he relied on only a few trusted allies, Saint-Just, Couthon, Labus, men who mirrored his ideals, but not always his caution. Outside, the mood in Paris had shifted. The people who had once sung the songs of revolution now muttered quietly. The streets that once pulsed with rallies and festivals had grown tense and tired. Fear still lived in every shadow, but the pride that had once filled the city had thinned. The guillotine had worked too long. Too many had vanished. Robespierre sensed the distance. He felt the betrayal before it came. He believed the Republic still faced enemies in foreign courts, in royalist plots, and the lukewarm revolutionaries who called for mercy. His speeches grew more passionate, more urgent, more severe. He spoke of a final purge, of one last sacrifice to secure the dream. But others in the convention heard something different, not a savior, but a tyrant. Robespierre had not only named enemies, he had made them. And now they were no longer afraid. The arrest, the date, was 9 Thermidor, year 2, July 27, 1794. Inside the National Convention, the air was thick with heat and tension. Robespierre had not spoken for several days. He had retreated from public view. When he returned, he gave a long speech, one filled with warning, filled with fire. He hinted at plots, accused unnamed traitors, and demanded more vigilance. But he refused to say who he meant. The silence was taken as threat. The room turned cold. Men who had once stood with him looked away. Whispers passed. Plans moved quickly. Later that same day, Robespierre was declared an outlaw by the convention. No debate, no formal charges. He Saint-Just and their allies were stripped of their rights. The power that had protected them was gone in a blink dot as word spread. Robespierre and his followers fled to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall of Paris. There they tried to rally the commune. Loyal guards stood with them. Supporters gathered. But the spark that had once moved the city was gone. No mass uprising came. No wave of people flooded the streets in his name. Throughout the night, confusion reigned. Some called for resistance. Others urged surrender. Robespierre, wounded by the betrayal, stood pale and quiet. Near midnight, gunfire rang out. Some say he tried to shoot himself and failed. Others say he was shot during the standoff. Either way, his jaw was shattered, and he bled onto the floor of the building that had once bowed to him. As dawn approached, soldiers stormed the hall. They found him lying broken, unable to speak, surrounded by his closest allies, all of them now prisoners. The incorruptible had been silenced. The guillotine. Waits, they brought him to the conciergerie, the very prison that had received thousands. Under his watch, the irony did not go unnoticed. The same papers he once signed now signed his fate. The same guards who once obeyed his word now turned away. There was no trial, no defense. He had been declared outside the law, and that was enough. On July 28th, Robespierre was placed in a cart and taken through the streets of Paris. His jaw was bandaged, his face pale. With him were 21 others, his allies, his friends, the voices who had once called for justice in the name of the people. Now they rode in silence. The crowds did not cheer. They did not chant. They watched. Some turned their heads. Some wept. Many simply stared. It was not the fall of a tyrant they saw. It was the end of something larger, the end of a fever, a dream. that had become a nightmare. At the Place de la Révolution, the guillotine waited. One by one, they climbed the steps. Saint-Just went without protest. Couthon, paralyzed, was carried up. When Robespierre's turn came, the bandage was ripped from his face. He tried to cry out. The sound was only pain. And then the blade fell. The same machine that had silenced so many now silenced its master. The man who had ruled by terror died by it. Not with glory, not with grace, but with the quiet end of a story that had gone too far. The terror ends with Robespierre's death. The spell of the terror broke. The blade did not vanish, not yet, but its rhythm changed. The fear that had held the convention in silence lifted. Those who had hidden their doubts began to speak. New names filled the chambers. New voices rose, calling for reason, for calm. The prisons emptied. The executions slowed. Laws passed to curb the power of the committees. The Jacobin clubs were closed. The festival of the Supreme Being was forgotten. And the guillotine, once the beating heart of the revolution, became a symbol of shame. The people of Paris exhaled, slowly, cautiously. The streets grew quieter, the eyes less watchful. For the first time in years, it seemed the revolution might breathe without blood. But the wounds ran deep. Families had been torn apart, trust shattered. The dream of liberty still lived, but it was now bruised, guarded, uncertain. The Republic had survived, but at a cost so high it could not yet be counted. And what of Robespierre? In the years that followed, history would struggle with his memory. Some saw him as a visionary lost to fanaticism, others as a tyrant cloaked in virtue. But the truth was more complex, a man who believed so deeply in justice that he could not see when it turned cruel. His fall marked not the end of the revolution, but the end of its most fevered hour. France would go on. The Republic would evolve. But the terror was over, and in its silence, a new era began, not one of certainty, but of fragile hope. Chapter 16. A Republic in Ashes. After the storm of the Reign of Terror, silence did not return as peace. It returned as a new kind of violence, quieter, but just as bitter. In the months that followed Robespierre's fall, France entered a time known as the White Terror. No guillotines were raised in grand parades this time, but in dark alleys, behind closed doors, and in remote prisons, vengeance seeped through the cracks of a nation still bleeding. Those who had once worn the red caps of the Jacobin now became the hunted. Moderates, royalists, and ordinary people who had suffered under the previous regime took justice into their own hands. It wasn't a movement guided by law or order, it was revenge dressed as justice. Mobs broke into homes. Prisons filled again, but this time with those who had once filled them with others. Names were whispered in the night. Former committee members were attacked. Sans-culottes vanished. The balance had shifted. It always does. The pendulum that had swung so violently to one extreme now rushed the other way, cutting through anyone left standing from the radical days. But what made the White Terror even more haunting was its quiet. There were no fiery speeches to mark these new deaths, no crowded plazas to cheer for justice. Just exhaustion, just silence. After so much shouting, France now moved in whispers, tired and cautious. It was as though the people no longer believed in the future, they only believed in surviving the next day. Whole neighborhoods held their breath. Friends stopped trusting friends. Even those who had simply supported the revolution out of hope, not hatred, found themselves unsafe. In this new phase, even memories became dangerous. And so, a strange new order emerged, one built not on freedom, but fear of remembering. A new constitution in 1795, the leaders who remained tried to give France something it hadn't had in years: structure. The result was the Constitution of Year 3, a document meant to replace chaos with control. Gone were the wild dreams of universal liberty. Gone were the sweeping declarations. In their place stood 5 men, a group called the Directory, chosen not for brilliance or bravery, but for balance. It was not revolution anymore. It was reaction. This new system didn't belong to the people. It belonged to the survivors. It was careful, calculated, and deeply afraid of the past. Power was no longer in the hands of a single voice like Robespierre's. Instead, it was shared among 5 cautious men who watched each other more than they watched the nation. Their job was not to lead France toward greatness. Their job was to stop it from falling apart again. And yet, even as they tried to hold the reins, corruption crept in like a quiet fog. Bribes replaced votes. Favors bought influence. The ideals that had once burned brightly in the revolutions, early days now flickered dimly, buried under layers of political deals and secret handshakes. The Directory didn't inspire. It endured. It didn't lift the people it managed them. And in the shadows of their offices, a different kind of hunger grew. Not the hunger for bread, but the hunger for control. Each member feared the others. Each one plotted to outlast the rest, but France was no longer a land of patience. The people had seen kings fall. They had heard promises shouted from rooftops. Now, all they heard was the quiet shuffle of paperwork and the endless ticking of a broken clock. The revolution had given them a voice. The Directory taught them silence. Bred in silence outside the halls of government, life did not get easier. The revolution had not solved hunger. It had only replaced one kind of starvation with another. Bread remained scarce. Markets sat half empty. Fields, once full of laborers, now stood quiet, scarred by war and neglect. And those who still worked the land did so under weighty skies heavy with memory, loss, and the ache of too many years without peace. The people who had once stormed Versailles with fury now waited in long, bitter lines for a loaf of stale bread. Their eyes no longer burned with purpose. They only watched the ground, tired, cold, and uncertain. Mothers held their children tighter, not out of love alone, but fear of what might happen if there was no food tomorrow. And yet, the government feared the people just as much. Protests, once seen as symbols of freedom, were now treated like threats. Gatherings were banned. Words became weapons. If you complained too loudly, someone might report you. If you spoke of the past, someone might silence you. Fear did not leave with Robespierre. It changed its clothes and stayed. Even in cafes and homes, conversations grew quieter. People talked in code or not at all. The once vibrant songs of revolution had faded into soft hums, carried by those who remembered but dared not sing. But hunger is a teacher, and silence, too, holds power. The people learned how to endure, how to hide their pain behind empty smiles and small gestures. They grew patient, but not forgetful. Each empty plate became a quiet promise that something must change. France, once filled with chants and cheers, now drifted through its days like a wounded traveler. Every street carried the weight of history. Every step reminded them how far they'd walked and how far they still had to go. Hope grows elsewhere while Paris nursed its wounds and its weariness. Hope did not die, it moved. It found new footing far from the debating halls and market squares. It put on boots, strapped on a sword, and rode with soldiers. For while the Republic struggled to feed its people, a young general was feeding something else entirely: ambition. Name was Napoleon Bonaparte. At first, he was a name few recognized. Just another officer, another product of the revolution's military chaos. But in time, he became something more. His victories in Italy weren't just tactical, they were theatrical. He returned with stories of triumph, parades of spoils, and the loyalty of men who would follow him anywhere. Where the Directory stumbled, Napoleon marched. Where the politicians whispered, he roared. He understood something that the tired leaders in Paris had forgotten. The people didn't just want bread. They wanted pride. They wanted movement. They wanted to believe in something again. Napoleon gave them that. He offered not just battles, but vision. In his speeches, there was no apology. No doubt, only fire. Only certainty. And after so many years of confusion, that certainty felt like water in a desert. He did not challenge the Directory directly, not yet, but he didn't need to. His victory spoke louder than any vote. His name began to appear in taverns, in newspapers, on the lips of soldiers and citizens alike. To many, he was not a general. He was a symbol. A new beginning. And so, even as the Republic stood on shaky legs, even as the ash of old fires still drifted through the air, something stirred. Not in the government halls, not in the broken homes, but on the fields of Europe under foreign skies, led by a man whose footsteps echoed with purpose. France, it seemed, was not done shaping the world. It was only changing how it did so. Chapter 17. The Rise of Napoleon. The story of Napoleon Bonaparte begins not in Paris, nor in the grand courts of Versailles, but on a small, rugged island in the Mediterranean, Corsica. Born in 1769, just months after the island was taken by France, Napoleon's early years were shaped by pride, poverty, and the echo of a land torn between old identity and new rule. He was not of noble blood. He was not born into wealth. He was born into change. Napoleon was a quiet child, sharp-eyed, withdrawn and fiercely driven. His accent marked him as an outsider when he was sent to mainland France for school. Other boys mocked his manners, his language, his background. But instead of breaking him, the ridicule sharpened his ambition. He buried himself in books on history and war, learning the strategies of Caesar and Alexander, studying maps like sacred texts. The world had told him he didn't belong, so he decided to rise high enough that no one could ignore him. The French Revolution, as violent and uncertain as it was, gave him that chance. It shattered the old order. It broke the rules that had once held people like him down. In the army, where the nobility had once claimed all the ranks, promotions now came through skill. And skill Napoleon had. He made his mark during the siege of Toulon in 1793. Young, bold, and brilliant with artillery, he turned a dangerous position into victory. From there, his rise was too quick for most to understand. He became a general at 24. His campaigns in Italy showed a genius not only for war, but for image. He wrote letters. He made sure the newspapers followed his victories. He crafted a version of himself for the people to admire, and they did admire him. His soldiers adored him. His enemies respected him. And in the quiet corridors of government, where the Directory clung to power with trembling hands, they began to fear him. He was a man born far from the center of France's power. But now, every path led toward him. The coup of 18 Brumaire in November of 1799. On a day the revolutionary calendar named 18 Brumaire, France changed course once again. The Directory, weak and hollow, was collapsing under its own weight. Corruption was eating away at its core. The people had grown tired of their leaders, tired of the promises that no longer meant anything. Into this vacuum stepped Napoleon, but he didn't march in with tanks or fanfare. He used strategy, he used timing, and he used fear. With a loyal army behind him and allies inside the government, he moved quickly. The plan was simple: break the old system, then replace it before anyone could stop him. Napoleon entered the halls of power not as a destroyer, but as a savior. He told the politicians that the Republic was in danger, that the government was corrupt, that only strong leadership could save France. Some resisted, some shouted, but many stayed silent. They had seen too much already. They didn't want another revolution. They wanted order. In just one day, the Directory fell, and a new government rose in its place, the consulate. It looked different, but it served one purpose: to put power in the hands of Napoleon. He became first consul, the leader of France. In all but name, the revolution had removed a king. Now, a new kind of ruler stood in his place. This was not a return to monarchy. Not yet. Napoleon didn't wear a crown. He wore the face of the Republic. He promised liberty. He promised law. But behind every promise stood the quiet knowledge that he, and only he, held the reins. France didn't protest. It sighed. The streets remained calm. No crowds gathered to oppose him. Because what Napoleon offered was not fear, it was rest. A chance to stop the bleeding. A chance to sleep. The revolution ends quietly. There was no grand ceremony. No official speech. Sudden halt to the movement. The French Revolution did not end with the fall of a king or the raising of a new flag. It ended with a whisper, carried softly across tired streets. By the time Napoleon took control, the revolution was not a force, it was a memory. The people no longer cheered in the squares or sang songs of liberty. They stood in long bread lines. They counted losses, not gains. They looked at their lives and wondered what it had all been for. What had the guillotine truly bought them? So when Napoleon offered peace, they accepted. When he promised stability, they listened. And when he placed the Republic's name beside his own, few asked questions. They had fought enough. They had suffered enough. And in Napoleon, they saw not a return to tyranny, but a pause in the chaos. He restored churches. He brought back order to the courts. He signed treaties to end wars. All of it wrapped in the language of the Republic, but shaped by his own will. The ideals of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, still hung in the air. But they no longer guided the future. They had become symbols, carefully kept but no longer lit. France had dreamed of a new world. Now it only wanted sleep. And Napoleon, the soldier with fire in his eyes, became the guardian of that sleep. What remained? Not all dreams die. Some drift beneath the surface, waiting. The French Revolution had begun with hope. It had screamed through the streets, filled the hearts of peasants and poets alike. But now, that hope was buried beneath new rules, new uniforms, and the steady march of a general turned leader. Liberty had been shaped into law, but laws now came from one voice. Equality had lost its meaning, as titles and privilege began to return, only in different forms. Fraternity had faded into silence. But something still remained. A seed. A memory. A question. What if it could still be different? Napoleon brought order, but he also brought ambition. He would crown himself emperor in time. He would build an empire. He would march across Europe. And in doing so, he would spread some of the revolution's ideas, justice, merit, and nationhood to places that had never known them. He did not destroy the revolution. He changed its shape. He carried its shadow with him, even as he stepped into the light of Empire. And for the people of France, what remained was not victory. It was not defeat. It was weariness. It was the stillness after a long storm. Some believed in him. Some feared him. But most simply wanted to live. The revolution had shaken the world. But in the end, it ended not with fire, but with fatigue. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of France, the dream that had once burned so brightly still flickered, waiting for its moment to rise again. Chapter 18. Echoes of the Revolution. The cannons had quieted. The mobs had vanished. The guillotine stood still. But long after the revolution's final breath, its ideas continued to move. They traveled not on banners, but in whispers and books. Not in crowds, but in hearts. The dream that had once shaken a kingdom, liberty, fraternity, equality, refused to be buried. These words, once cried from balconies and painted on crumbling walls, were not forgotten. They became seeds. And across Europe and beyond, those seeds found soil. In the Americas, in parts of Asia, and even in corners of Africa, people read of the French Revolution and felt something stir. A realization that power, once thought to belong to kings alone, could be questioned. That governments, once wrapped in robes of divinity, could be changed by ordinary hands. The revolution didn't create freedom, but it named it, it gave it form, and though the form was cracked and bloody, it was still new. The world looked on and saw people who had dared to break their chains, not just with words, but with action. Even those who feared the violence could not ignore the message. Behind it, in the centuries that followed, revolutions echoed in places far from Paris. Some were peaceful. Others were not. But each one, in some way, carried the scent of 1789. In chants, in constitutions, in flags waving above city squares, the shadow of France's great gamble lingered. And for those who carried on the dream, the ideas of the revolution became something sacred, not perfect, not pure, but enduring. Liberty that meant the right to live free from fear. Equality that said no birthright could make one better. Fraternity that promised unity through shared struggle. These were not just political thoughts. They were human ones. Born not only in Paris, but in every corner of the world where someone looked at power and asked, why them? Why not us? The scars that remain, but every idea, no matter how noble, has a cost. And in France, that cost was steep. When the revolution began, Few imagined the scale of the storm it would bring. By the time it had ended, the land was soaked not only with hope, but with sorrow. An estimated 2 million people died during the decade-long upheaval. Soldiers, civilians, monarchs, radicals, priests, children. The revolution did not spare the old or the young. It did not pause for prayers or pleadings. It devoured as it moved, hungry for change, and sometimes too blind to see who it hurt. Families were torn apart, some by war, others by politics. Brothers turned against brothers. Neighbors reported neighbors. The spirit of revolution, once so full of unity, became twisted with suspicion and revenge. What had started with the promise of brotherhood ended, at times, in the silence of mass graves. Cities changed. Churches emptied. Fields burned. And in the countryside, people remembered not just the speeches of freedom, but the empty harvests. The missing sons and the fear that came when footsteps echoed outside their doors at night. Still, through all this, something was bought. Not peace, not perfection, but a lesson. The world had seen what happened when people rose. It had seen how far power would go to stay unchallenged. And it had seen how fragile order could be when built on the suffering of the many. The revolution. Left behind ruins, yes, but it also left behind a warning that freedom is never free, that equality is not given but fought for, that the price of change is often paid in grief, and yet, despite all the sorrow, France survived. And in surviving, it taught the world something essential, that the human spirit, even when bruised and bloodied, still reaches toward justice. The long shadow of 1789, even now. Centuries later, the year 1789 casts a long shadow. It follows every movement that reases against injustice. It lingers in courtrooms where laws are challenged. It speaks softly in classrooms where young minds first ask, "What is freedom?" The French Revolution was not the first of its kind, but it became the most symbolic, because it was not led by one great figure, but by many. Not fought in one great battle, but in 1,000 tiny acts. It was messy, painful, and unfinished. And in that, it became real. Movements from South America to South Asia, from Eastern Europe to the heart of Africa, would borrow from the French example. Some borrowed its ideas, others borrowed its symbols, but nearly all borrowed its courage, the willingness to stand up, even when the outcome was uncertain, and the fear it caused, that too lingered. Governments across the world learned from France. Some learned to suppress their people harder. Others learned to listen sooner. But no ruler could ignore what had happened in Paris. That once, the powerless had found their voice. And it had been louder than a king's crown. In the arts, in philosophy, and in law, the echoes of the revolution are still heard. Its debates about who should lead, what rights are natural, and how much power is too much still rage today. Not only in parliaments, but in protests, in petitions, in everyday conversation. The world turned a corner in 1789, and it has never fully turned back. Sleep without forgetting. As France moved forward into the 19th century, the wounds of revolution began to fade, but they did not vanish. The Bastille was gone, its stones scattered. The monarchy was gone, replaced by emperors, republics, and yet more uncertainty. But the memories remained. In the quiet streets of Paris, in the countryside villages, in the libraries and monuments, the revolution lived on, not as a daily struggle, but as a memory stitched into the fabric of the nation. It was not forgotten. It was folded gently into the story of who the French people were. They learned to live with the contradiction that the revolution had brought both greatness and grief, that it had promised much and delivered unevenly, that it had both saved and scarred. But healing does not mean forgetting, and forgetting does not bring peace. France chose instead to remember, to teach the revolution, to study it, to debate it still. Not because they wished to relive it, but because they understood that its lessons were too costly to be ignored. Statues were raised, poems were written. Schools taught children about the storming of the Bastille, the cry for liberty, and the danger of letting power concentrate in too few hands. They remembered not only the heroes, but the victims. Not only the speeches, but the silence that followed. Them that the French Revolution became a mirror, not of a single event, but of something deeper. A mirror held up to all humanity, asking, what kind of world do we want? What are we willing to do to get it? And what do we lose along the way? Tonight, as we fall asleep, that mirror remains quiet, still, but waiting. For in every age, in every land, there comes a time when people must choose again between fear and hope, between comfort and change, between silence and speech. The revolution may have ended, but its echoes soft, steady, and sacred still drift through time, waiting to be heard.